all gathered here today so we could meet with the author of the month, Don Lynch. And we're
Well,
going
thank
to
you.
read.
Thank you for choosing Illustrated History this month.
Oh,
Yay!
we thought we needed to choose something that, is a classic and loved by so many.
Oh,
Well, you
good.
can see in my background.
I mean, it's gosh, over 30 years ago now. It's just so hard to believe that it's been out for that long.
I know.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, let me do my little intro here.
Okay. All right. Good.
All right, so Don Lynch here was born. Oh, wow, I might have to have some help with
Coeur d'Alene.
Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, and raised in Washington State, where he began researching the Titanic while still in high school in Spokane.
Spokane.
Oh, it's not Spokane?
No,
Spokane.
no. In Washington, it's Spokane. In Missouri, it's Spokane.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Oh, do I not have my camera on? All right, let's see. Okay, thank you, Don. In the 5 decades since he's traveled to museums and archives throughout the United States, Canada, England, and Ireland to conduct his research, he has met and interviewed 20 passengers from the Titanic, as well as numerous relatives and survivors and victims. Relatives of survivors and victims. For many years, he has been the official historian for the Titanic Historical Society. In 1992, Don wrote the text for the book Titanic, an Illustrated History, our book of the month, which went on to spend 12 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Director James Cameron hired Don as the historian for the movie Titanic in the summer of 2001. He hired Don as consultants to his Ghosts of the Abyss project, where they drove to the Titanic in a Russian submersible to film the wreck for his 3D large format documentary, which Judy here was also in. Don wrote the text for the companion book, Ghosts of the Abyss, and most recently was a contributor for the James Cameron book, Exploring the Deep, the Titanic Expeditions.
Thank you.
Wow.
That's a lot. Spotlight you, Don.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank
Here
you
I'm
so
scratching
much.
my nose and you're spotlighting me. Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for joining us. And we have a few of our book club members here too. And also with us, we have Caden from the Book Club for Children, I believe. Are you in here, Caden?
Maybe, maybe not.
Looks like he isn't.
Oh, maybe he didn't get here. Okay. So we're just going to try to have a really relaxed format. We do have questions that we gathered from the members.
Yeah, I printed them out just in case. I got my little notes about answers. So,
and we have lots of, I don't, I think a lot of our members think that you're a wreck person when I know that you are a passenger person. So some of those might be a little tricky, but I noticed that you didn't cross any off your list. So.
no, they're fine. I mean, obviously I've been down there, I've seen the wreck. I don't analyze the wreck the way some people do and study, how but I think it's important, to study the wreck and see how the story it tells of how the ship broke apart. And that's one of the reasons I'm kind of against salvage, because when you go and start plucking things up, you've lost that piece of the story. It's like where the kitchen equipment landed tells part of the breakup story. And if all that equipment has been removed and you didn't document where it came from, you've lost that. So I'm very respectful of the wreck, and I respect people who analyze it and study it, but I'm not the student that they are. I look at that interior footage and I have no clue where I am. It's like the camera goes in there and it's like, what are we looking at? And then, Ken Marshall can just say, well, this is this, whatever, and that shows where this cabin was, and you can see that used to be this. And, he's just all over it. Whereas I just look at it and it's a mess, but anyway, but I do appreciate the wreck, and I can talk a little bit about diving through it.
Oh, okay. That's great. Yeah, with the Titanic Social Club just watched Ghosts of the Abyss with Judy, the extended edition.
Cool.
It was really fun to see see that. And she actually shared some photos with us from, some green screen photos.
Yes. Great. Because that was fun. That was a good experience too. It's kind of nice that we got to come back, those of us who'd worked together on Titanic, and get to be in Ghosts of the Abyss. Some new people, obviously faces too, but that was, a lot of the same costumes, things like that from Titanic. That was fun. A little more informal.
So do you want to start? How did you get interested in?
Okay, yeah, let's see. How did I get interested? Well, the story, the whole story is, I think, and I think is true for everyone here, you're kind of born with it. It's like people who collect stamps. They can't say why, they can say kind of how it interests them. And so I think you're kind of born with it. But until you discover it, you don't know. And I remember, seeing the 1953 Titanic as a child on TV on a Saturday afternoon. And my brother remembered later that I was all agog over it. I don't remember that, but I remember on Monday going to school and everybody saying, "Did you see Titanic on TV on Saturday?" And so obviously all the kids thought it was pretty cool. But then in 1973, I saw the Poseidon Adventure, and which on the big screen is pretty cool. On the small screen, you see it on TV, it looks kind of, yeah. But, that was pretty impressive. And I thought, well, gosh, I wonder what real shipwrecks are like. And so I, checked out some books from the library, and one of which was A Night to Remember. And that just grabbed me. I read it, and then I stopped and I read it again. I just turned right around and read it from start to finish again. And then I always like to learn more about something when it interested me. And so I, started looking for other books. And then I joined the Titanic Historical Society, which I wrote to Harland and Wolff asking about the ship, and they referred me to the Titanic Historical Society. And so I joined that and just started wondering, well, whatever happened to all the survivors? Because the THS had always made them honor members. And when you think about all the people who were like immigrants in maybe 18 years at the time, and when the THS was formed, they probably would have been maybe 70. And yet, where were they when the society was formed and gave people memberships? And even though they had more survivors than regular members when they were first formed. And so I started looking into that. And then, of course, you can't study what happened to them without finding out their stories. You'd write to a library or something, and then they would print out from their microfilm, or copy for you what the local paper said about the people when they got there. And so it just kind of kept growing and growing and learning more and more about them. And then I went to the 1977 THS convention and met George. And it just kept growing and growing from there on. And, you kind of dig a hole you can't climb out of.
Wow. But how did you become official historian because of your vast knowledge?
I think so. I don't remember when it actually happened. They sort of, back in the day, they had an advisory board and they put me on that right away. And I think probably because I kept sending them the names of survivors and saying, well, here's somebody you don't have on your membership roster. And here's, so-and-so. And so Ed kind of put me on the advisory board. And then at some point, I think, they made me the historian. Maybe when Jack Eaton stepped down, it must have been. So that must have been in the 80s. So I don't remember when exactly it happened, but obviously I didn't turn it down. It's like, oh, cool. And the nice thing about that, especially back then before social media, I need to make a note of this because George and I are both working on articles about the THS and its history, and part of the focus is how much things have changed. But people used to write into the THS. And like, I remember, wondering whatever happened to, say, for example, Mary Ann Perot's, family, whatever happened to her, Mrs. Hayes's maid. And then all of a sudden the THS will get a letter from this woman saying, well, Mary Ann Perot was my grandmother. And, I'd like to join the society. And it's like, oh my gosh, we found the family, this kind of thing. And really, people would just write in. I remember Phil Gowan used to have, he used to track down the survivors a lot and try to find every one of them. And he always had so much trouble with Albina Bazzani, the maid to Mrs. Bucknell. And I remember telling him, well, we had a letter once from a lady here in Los Angeles who said she was her neighbor back in the 30s when she was a little girl. And she provided her married name. And so that kind of gave us a leaping off point. And then with Phil's help, especially Phil's help, we were able to find this woman's daughter and get her mother's story before the woman passed away in her 90s. But it was interesting because Albina's daughter didn't know when her mother had died. They were estranged. But, with her help, and what, everything and what eventually become of her, Phil was able to find that she had died in Massachusetts around 1962 or something. And then eventually, found her grave and visited it and everything. But so, being involved with the THS really helped because people would write to the THS. And I was really surprised because you could go back there and Ed would just let you go through all the files. And he had a letter from Mary Marvin, Mrs. Daniel Marvin, who never gave interviews. And yet he didn't make her an honor member or something, but she just wrote in one time and just said, I've heard about your organization. I was on the Titanic. I'm one of the survivors, whatever. I can't remember what else she said. And, but we'd found her anyway. We knew where she was. I think she was dead by the time I tracked her down, but she had just written to him all of a sudden at the end of her life and just, said, well, I'm Mary Marvin. Or it wasn't her name then. It was DeCamp when she passed away. But that, the THS was a great source for information as people would write in and identify themselves or share things or whatever, which was so as a historian, I not only did research, but I sort of gathered material from the society that helped me in my research, which was really wonderful.
Wow. Yeah, because I remember when I first started, looking around to see if there was any groups, and I found the Titanic Historical Society. I was so excited, because people thought I was a little bit strange.
Yeah, well, they do. And I remember people back in the day saying, well, what'll happen when the last survivor is gone? Will the society fold? And I kept saying, well, every year there's fewer survivors, and every year the society has more members. How can that be? It's like you're sort of, that's counterintuitive to think that as the society's growing, it'll just suddenly implode when the last survivor dies. And of course, after the movie came out, I think their membership hit 10,000. It's dropped obviously since then, but everybody everywhere wanted to join the society, and that was just a horrible year. Too many people writing in asking questions that I couldn't possibly answer. And then the THS didn't know how many magazines to print because they didn't know from one quarter to the next if they'd have enough, and if they printed too many and spent the money and then not enough people joined. And they had a terrible time that year. It was just, then of course it tapered off and leveled off or whatever, but that was a hard time. It was an exciting time, but it was a difficult time.
Yeah, I can imagine. And then when did you meet George?
George and I talk about this.
I thought you two
Here's where the story starts going downhill.
Yeah. Well, George and I were introduced. George, I speak for him, but George, this has come up recently because George remembered it being at the very end of the 77 convention. But I went to the 77 convention and Jack Eaton said, here's somebody you need to meet, because his interests are the same as yours, and he introduced me to George. But I know it was early in the convention because we sat at the same table at the banquet on Saturday night. And so, there's a group photo, and I think there were like 8 of us at the table, and of the 8, 1 passed away about within 5 years, we'll say. Another one I don't even think ever came to a convention again, and the other 6 came back year after year after year, it seemed. Obviously it was Ken Marshall, Mac Chapman, Dennis Fayenza, George, me, and so how many is that? 1, 2, 3. That's 5. There must have been 8 of us, but anyway. But so we were introduced by Jack Eaton at the 1977 convention, and after I got home, and George and I, we hit it off right away. Just immediately, liked each other, and found that we did share the interests. And it was funny because when I got home, George wrote me and said, I'm going to ask something. He said, but I would love it, and I'll reciprocate, but would you photocopy all your research material for me and I'll
I remember.
photocopy all mine for yours? And he said, I think I can hear you scream from here. But we did, over the years, we've always shared everything, which has been fantastic, and George, because George researches so well and so in depth. And although I think there was one item about Marion Wright one time that came up and you said I had never sent it to you, and maybe I didn't, but I was shocked because I always had a folder of photocopies that were sent to George. And of course, back then it was always in the mail, just every time I'd write to him, I'd be able to stuff in some photocopies and send them off. And so, yeah, we've just collaborated, whatever, stayed in touch, and shared all our information. We've never withheld from each other. George is virtually my best friend. It's just, even though we don't see each other that often, but with that kind of history, how can he not be?
Yeah.
I feel the same way about Don. We just hit it off immediately, and we've had the trust and the friendship ever since then. I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah. We played a few jokes on each other, which we don't do anymore because they were cruel and harsh.
Hey, what kind of jokes?
Let's just say we sent letters to each other and signed somebody else's name and scared each other to death. So, but that's all we'll say. We won't go into it.
The one that my memorable one is I sent Don a letter and I signed his literary agent's name. And I told him that he had his manuscript. They couldn't find a book publisher, but they found a magazine that they published it in. And Don was horrified. I won't name the magazine.
Yeah. But anyway, and I will say that's been the great thing, not just about the THS, but about the Titanic in general, is I think we've all made really good friends there. I mean, obviously Judy and I have stayed in touch since the movie and been great friends. And Jill, you too. I mean, gosh, we went to Catalina.
I know, that was so much fun.
That was fun. That was a fun few days. That was great. When they had their exhibit at the museum there. And so, it's just, I've made a lot of friends, and, and that's what I like about the Titanic Historical Society conventions, is that sometimes they're friends. It's the only time I get to see them, and it's just nice to get together once in a while like that.
Yeah, and have that common interest. Go ahead, George.
I was just going to say, Don, that's the best part of the conventions for me. I don't go there to hear the lectures or this and that. I go there to see my friends because, as you say, we get to see each other so seldom that's the high point of any convention for me, is seeing my other friends.
Absolutely, it really is. And one of the questions Jill sent me was about my favorite conventions. And I can be selfish. There, one of them, I'll always remember, it was the 1992 convention, and I wasn't yet an author. And there were about 500 people there. And at the conventions, Ed always would give a plaque to people. I mean, if you helped out, you got a plaque or a certificate of appreciation, something. I mean, you'd always do something to present you as something you could hold in your hand that showed how grateful he was. And when they presented me with one and called me up, the entire banquet of 500 people gave me a standing ovation. And I wasn't Don Lynch author yet. I wasn't Don Lynch, the guy from the movie. I was Don Lynch, the guy with the THS. And to get that standing ovation was so moving for me. And then, of course, the other convention is the one on the Queen Mary, where we shared the ship with the International Foundation for Gender Education. And it was a ship full of, Titanic Historical Society people, and a ship full of cross-dressers, transsexuals, transvestites, you name it. And so, it was an educational experience. It was eye-opening. I learned the difference between a drag queen and a transvestite. Drag queens want to look like a woman, transvestites feel they need to dress in women's clothing, nutshell. And then we had a lesbian wedding in the room next to our banquet. And then they had a pipe burst and the corridor flooded to the banquet room. And so it's like the ship was going down while we were having our banquet. And then apparently they were filming a porno on a boat out in the harbor, and the boat sank, and the Coast Guard is fishing all these naked people out of the water right next to the Queen Mary. And
I just barely made it to shore, Don.
but we had this one member from Alabama, and he had never been out of Alabama before, and he'd come to the Queen Mary, to horrible California, the land of fruits, nuts, and flakes, the granola bowl. And he called home and told his boss all these things that were happening. His boss was horrified. He's like, "You get on a plane and you get home right now. You've got to get out of there." And it was hysterical. It was just, one of those conventions you just talk about for years. I mean, we had a good time, obviously, because it was also the convention that preceded the release of the movie. And so like Judy was there as one of the speakers, and several other of the extras and people who had worked on it. And so, this was sort of in anticipation of the movie. Here's what's coming kind of thing. And so obviously this other group wasn't the highlight of our convention, but it was a really good convention. And that in some ways is my favorite because it sort of went down in history. I could say also the 1987 one. I don't want to say it was my favorite because that was the first one I ever organized. And we had over 1,000 people, and it was hell. And so
Wow.
that one was, I had never organized anything on that scale. And I obviously didn't do it alone. I obviously had people helping me, but it was just awful. There was a local paper that was very hostile towards the society. Don't know why. Even hostile towards, like, there were Carl Bear and Helen Newsom, the survivors. Their daughter lived there in Wilmington, Delaware, and he even attacked her father in the paper and stuff like that, and just had her in tears. And and nobody cared. Like I even mentioned to the Chamber of Commerce, we're getting all this bad press, and they're like, "Well, it doesn't seem to be hurting you." But just to organize when the hotel couldn't accommodate 1,000 people, so it was that sort of thing. And, plus this is the first one where we really had offered to pay the survivors way there. And so what did we have, like, 10 survivors or something? And then Dr. Ballard, because this is the first convention since he found the ship. And I knew we were doing something historic. I really did. And people to this day, still talk about, "Oh my gosh, I remember that 1987 convention and how fantastic that was." And even the vendors, I remember one of the vendors, because people would come and say, Stell, and Peter Boyd Smith from Cobwebs in Southampton said, "I couldn't take money fast enough." He said, "I had to have my son sit on cash. All I could do was just hand it to him because people were buying everything so quickly." And, people would say, I had to stay through every lecture because if I got up to use the restroom, I'd come back and there was no place to sit, this kind of thing. And it was very draining. And so, that one, I'll say, without, taking credit, that it was a great convention for a lot of people. But on the other hand, it was very, very hard on me. And so I can't say it was my favorite because I didn't get to enjoy it as much as some of the others. But anyway, those were that was one of the questions about my favorite convention. So those are my convention stories. The others are well, in fact, what was interesting was, we had 10 survivors in 87. And then Edith Haseman didn't come back the next year, but the next year, Melvina Dean came for his first convention she ever came to, and only the second Titanic event in her life. And then Beatrice Sandström came from Sweden. So the next year in 88, which was a much smaller convention, we had about 350 people. That was at the Copley Plaza, which opened in 1912 in Boston. So we had this wonderful historic hotel, but it was the largest gathering of Titanic survivors since the premiere of A Night to Remember in 1958. And so to think that 30 years later, we, kind of made a record. And then after that, we never had that many again, because of course, as they were getting older and, we were approaching the, 80th anniversary, we were losing them. But, they were all lovely people, they were so kind. And, they're all unique personalities and whatever. And as the organizer, of course, I had to, corral them, I guess you could say, but the idea was that they would come and they would meet all the members and they would have a good time, and the members would appreciate it. And so we'd always pay their way we'd give them like their own private banquets so they could all spend a little bit of time with each other and some of the volunteers, and send them on a tour of whatever city we were doing. To get a private tour of Boston or Philadelphia, whichever, wherever the convention was. And so we tried to treat them very, very well, and then they loved to come back.
It must be so different now without the survivors.
It is different. And, as I get older, because of course I was young then, and as I get older, I look back and I realize how fortunate we were to know them. And I was so fortunate to know the ones I did. And I wish I had, I had Edwina Trout and Ruth Becker fairly close here, and got to know them very well and appreciate them. And I wish I could have gotten over to England more as a young man to visit more with Eva Hart and Edith Haseman and people like that. And then, even like, excuse me, I'm not crying, it's allergy season. I could cry if you get me started. But I also, like, for example, Mrs. John Pillsbury Snyder, of course, I can't call her, Nell Snyder the way I call Ruth Becker, because she was first class. But a lovely lady, and I talked to her a couple of times on the phone. I met her at the 77 convention. And I always felt that if I could have spent more time with her, I would have gotten more memories out of her, because she did remember little details. And I dug out some notes one time, and George uses in one of his books, but she remembered air leaking around their porthole. When you close the porthole, air still came in, around it. It leaked a little bit. And so, just little details like that are, kind of tell us more about the Titanic story. That, you go to your room, you close the porthole, you turn on the heater, and it's still a little drafty kind of thing. And so I have a feeling that if, she had been, had people come and visit her and sit down with her regularly the way we did with Ruth and Winnie, she probably would have remembered more, just because that's what they did. It's sad to say, if reminded them of it, and if they were willing to be reminded, they would think about it more, and they would come up with memories from time to time. And I was always, like, I was amazed when I was going through my notes one time. Ruth Becker, she was 12 years old. She could remember 70 years later exactly how many rockets she saw go up, because she wasn't on deck the whole time. And I had in my notes one time where, she came up on deck, and between then and the last rocket, she saw 5. So she'd obviously missed the first 3. But, who after 70 years would remember a little detail like that? And how many little details like that did other survivors remember that they never conjured up or never shared with anybody, because nobody sat down with them and kind of grilled them over and over again? So I was fortunate to know the ones I did, very fortunate. And I just wish I could have known the others better, but I just didn't have the resources to visit them all the time.
Do you remember the first survivor that you'd ever met?
Well, yeah, that was Edwina Mackenzie. I
Right.
visited California in 1976. Rusty Brown, who is long gone, she unfortunately died at a relatively early age of a heart attack. But she was writing the book, The Titanic, the Psychic, and the Sea. And she was a columnist in the community of Lomita, back when a lot of LA communities still had their own little newspapers. And she wrote a column for the local paper there. Well, she went and interviewed Edwina Mackenzie and hit it off. The two of them just became the best friends. And Winnie was fun. And I shouldn't say it, but Rusty was a little dizzy. And so they kind of just, really hit up. But Rusty was so sweet, just a very sweet person. And so she was writing this book, and she asked if I would kind of come down and proofread it in person. And I thought, well, that's cool. And I was in college, and I thought, you know what, I'll go to California. I had relatives here in California. One reason why I ended up moving here after college. And so I came down to visit her. And then the idea was I'd go on it was over Thanksgiving vacation. So I was going to go spend Thanksgiving with my mother's sister. But anyway, then after I'd read it, I think Rusty didn't know what to do with me. So she pawned me off on Ken Marshall for a few days. And so then he and I got to be friends. And then I, went on, but then saw Ken again the next year in 77 at the THS convention. And then we've just been friends ever since. And Rusty, sadly, suffered a massive heart attack in Hawaii, which is the best place to have one because all the best heart people doctors get to live wherever they want, and they all live in Hawaii, apparently. And so she had lost 3/4 of her heart to this heart attack. And they told her, you don't have enough to have a second heart attack, and they gave her about 5 years. And I think she lasted 5.5 and then just dropped dead one day. And but she, fortunately she did outlive Winnie, because I think Winnie would have been devastated, for her friend to pass away like that. But she treated Winnie like a friend and not like a 99-year-old woman, so Winnie appreciated that. But anyway, that's how so Winnie was my first survivor because Rusty took me to meet her. And, she was very sweet, very nice.
Don was
Wow.
at one THS convention. I can't remember which one it was, but Walter Lord was there. Was that the first time you ever met Walter?
No. Okay. So, guy, did you submit that question? No. I've got to think. It'd be 1981. I went actually with Ken and some other friends. We took a cruise on the Rotterdam out of New York. Which is another great story because we hit a hurricane and we kind of, did the Poseidon Adventure thing where we, got hit by a tidal wave and heeled way over. But while we were in New York, we flew in for the night before and we thought, we'll go see Walter Lord. But it was funny, one friend, Alan Hubbard, a THS member, his wife didn't tell him. And that was a big surprise for him. And so we were like, what are you going to do this evening? And it was like, we're going to visit Walter Lord. And he was so thrilled. I mean, Alan was. Walter probably didn't care. But anyway, we went and visited Walter Lord. And my memory was, of course, he was a very, very gracious host. I kind of remember that when you visited him, you visited him. Like if you showed up, and wanted to see his stuff, I think he would be a little offended if you paid more attention to his collection than you did to him. I think he appreciated the company and wasn't just there to show you his things. But it was funny because he shook a little. And so my immediate thought was, oh, he drinks. And he did mix a strong drink. I mean, he offered us, a drink and it's like, sure. And it was strong. And I think, oh, that's why his hands shake. Well, no, it wasn't alcoholism at all. He had Parkinson's, but it hadn't been made public yet. And then, of course, he suffered with that, for, 20 more years or something like that. So, but that was the first time I met Walter, and he was very, very nice. And then I went back about 4 years later and visited him again at his home. And then he'd come to the conventions when he was able. And so always a very nice man. I spoke to him, once on the phone, and I won't go into all the backstory of what everybody said. I think of all the people in the Titanic community, said you're like the only gentleman because there's always tension and fighting and animosity and jealousies in any community, of historians or whatever. And that I just thought was a very, very nice thing of him to say, because if anything, he was the gentleman more than me. But very, very nice man. So I really appreciated getting to know him, and the fact that he was willing to, if you did tell him, I want to see this and this, while I'm visiting you, he would dig it out of storage and show you, it just didn't make that the focus of your visit, that kind of thing. And he was great, really nice guy.
Wow. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Does anyone else want to jump in? I want to monopolize, but
You mean about like our conventions?
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that was the first time that we had talked on the phone. I had talked to Ken on the phone. And that was the first time in 96 when I actually got to meet both of them. Because every time it seemed like they were on the set, we were not. Ellen and I were not. Because we were third class. And of course, I think the only time that we were probably on set together was when we were doing the lifeboat scenes and getting lowered up and down, but we did not have a chance to meet each other.
Yeah, I don't know. We didn't. I'm sure we met offset, but yeah. But it was funny because on the movie set, of course, like you said, you were third class. There were classes on the movie set, and of course, you know, the main stars were first class, and they had their own dining tent where they got, you know, lobster and crab legs and all that. And then the production people were second class, and that would be Ken and me. And so we got good food, nice food. And then the extras were third class. And you've talked before about the kind of food you got fed, which actually I got fed too when I was an extra. I got demoted to third class the week I was an extra.
I thought it was always funny that the young man that Don did his scene with the ball, I always thought that was his real son.
Everybody did. My gosh. You know, it's like a small town in the gossip because, you know, somebody commented about him being your son or something. And I said, well, he's not my son. And they thought that his mother was my wife because she was an extra also. And his sister was on set, and they thought that was my wife, my kids. And it's like, no, you know, it's like, they're not. Well, then the word went around that, you know, my wife was very ill and that's why she wasn't there. And it's like, well, I'm not married, you know. You know, but that was okay. If this lady isn't your wife, you must have one somewhere. And if she wasn't deadly ill or dying, she would be here, kind of thing. So, you know, there were just kind of, that's how the rumor mill works on, you know, a movie set kind of thing. It was just sort of funny. But I will say, you know, I stayed in touch. You know, I sent Christmas cards, you know, to his mother for a while there. And it was funny because she said, you know, whenever they were promoting the movie, she said her son would sit there and say, hey, my dad's on TV again. So he eventually, they were from San Diego, and Thomas Fiss was his name. And so, you know, some years ago, I thought, well, whatever happened to him? And I looked him up, and he, you know, he tried acting obviously as a child, but he went into music. And he actually hosted some teen award show or something like that. And, you know, had a lot of online music releases, no actual CD you could buy as far as I know. Well, today, I mean, he's married, he has his own family, and he's an executive with Sony Music. So, you know, he grew up well, you know, it's like he was well raised and, you know, went on to a nice career. So I'm happy for him, you know, it was great.
As for the second class areas, I don't think we had any as them being planned. I don't know. That would have to be something that you guys, you would have to answer.
Yeah, when I was saying second class, I meant second class for the people working on the movie, not the ship, you know, in the movie, because they did cast a few people. I know they cast Joseph LaRoche and they cast Ruth Becker. You know, they cast, because they were trying to cast people who looked like them, but that was fairly early. And then they ended up not doing anything with second class at all. Because Jim wanted to show the gap between first and third. And so he didn't want to show anything that was in the middle. And so they were excised. But as far as when the cameras were turned off, if you were a production person, you were a second class, you know, citizen or a second class employee, you would say. And so we had our own, you know, huge, you know, dining tent and, you know, good food and everything. But that was for production people. And so versus the extras, because when we were an extra, it was over Thanksgiving week, and we were there on Thanksgiving, because Mexico, they don't celebrate Thanksgiving, at least not American Thanksgiving, but they did on that Thursday try to make a Thanksgiving dinner for us. And I don't think the word gravy exists in the Spanish language. I mean, it was just awful. And I appreciate that they tried, but when we got back to LA, before Ed and Karen flew home, you know, we had a right proper Thanksgiving dinner at my house, you know, because we hadn't had one in Mexico, that was for sure. Oh, okay. I'm looking at somebody's question, Caden Roberts.
Caden, do you want to unmute and ask your question? Caden is a young person. He helps with the book club for children, and his very first post 4 years ago was about your book, Don.
Ooh. Yes, it was actually the second book about Titanic that I ever got, which I don't remember if it was in December of 2017 or like early 2018, but I know I got into Titanic around November 2017. And your book was actually the second Titanic book I ever got.
Oh, cool. Great. What was the first?
It was from the I Survived series by Lauren Tarshis. It's called I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic 1912. And I think I got that one in like November or December of 17.
Cool. Great.
Wow. So yeah, what would be like?
Yeah, let's.
So if second class employees is like what you just described, like as far as like working on the movie, what would be first and third class?
Well, third class were the extras, the people who weren't allowed to speak on camera, like Judy, people in the background, who were, people dancing, whatever, people sitting in lifeboats, people in the public rooms, behind the actors and actresses. And then first class were that would be James Cameron, obviously, but I bet you, as I recall, though, I bet you Jim ate in his trailer, because he probably would have been, watching dailies, as they call them, while he was eating. But high-end production people like the assistant director or whatever, that kind of stuff, if they had anybody visiting the set. But then the named actors, obviously Kate, Leo, and of course, her name just went out of my head. The one who played Molly Brown, but in the movie, not
Kathy Bates.
Kathy Bates, thank you. It was funny because Judy and I ran into Kathy Bates one
Yeah.
time having lunch not too far from here, and there's Kathy Bates walking by, and Judy made me go up and talk to her. And,
They'd make you do that.
yeah, she doesn't. LA is a small town. You run into people. You really do. In the central LA. Los Angeles here, and you do run into people all the time. And where I have my PO box is, and I think she still lives in that area. It's about 3.5-4 miles from here. I walk there once in a while, but that's the neighborhood Kathy Bates lives in. But I just have my PO box there because it's a place I can get into 24/7 if I just punch a code in the door. So that's why I got it there. But it's where also my physical therapist is. But anyway, and I've seen other celebrities there, and it's called Larchmont Boulevard. I saw Jason Alexander there one time, and I saw Suzanne Plachette and what was her, Tom Poston, when they were married. They were both there. And usually in LA, if I'm just off topic, but if I'm walking around, I don't notice celebrities. And like if Judy hadn't pointed out Kathy Bates, I would not even noticed her walk by. So
well, when he brought me over to introduce me, he goes, Molly Brown, meet Molly Brown. That was funny.
She's gracious. She's nice. She always plays these down to earth. Well, like in Misery, she plays misery with people, but she always sort of plays these very unglamorous roles, and yet she's very refined and very polite, and just a lovely lady. But those aren't the characters she plays. She is an actress, and so she plays people who are very different from who she is in real life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Cool.
But yeah, that when we met at the convention, I didn't hear that story about the boat sinking. And George, I'm glad you made it back.
It was a close one.
Like, oh my gosh.
Well, I know I didn't witness it either. Again, it's Los Angeles. What do you do? So.
And then we had a little convention back in Chicago. That when Jeff was still with us, we went back there and had that convention in Chicago. That was fun.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you guys treated me very well. That was nice. Yeah. And I was gonna, it was funny, Judy, at the 97 convention on the Queen Mary, Andre Presley was there. And Andre was the daughter of Harriet Crosby, one of the first class passengers, and she wore the fur that her mother wore in the lifeboat. She brought it and wore it to our banquet.
Wow.
And I've no comment on you personally, Judy, but I wanted to get a photo of you next to her so badly, because I'm 6'1". Andre was in her 80s. And she towered over me. And
that was the tall. Okay, I remember her.
I know, and I thought, because Judy, I always love your story about on Ghost of the Abyss when you were in the lifeboat and Jim told you to stand up and you were already standing up.
No, I jumped down and disappeared.
Yeah, and it's like, oh my gosh, I would love it. Get Judy next to Andre and just like here's this lady, because Andre's granddaughter is the actress Amy Hathaway, and Amy Hathaway I guess is 5'1", and imagine if you were a grown adult and your grandmother was like 15 inches taller than you. It amazed me. I loved her dearly. She was a lovely, lovely lady, but the whole story about her being so tall was, you know, part of her history. And this is a woman who, you know, she was a dancer as a young woman, and I've seen photos where she was like a man, supposedly a normal height man, standing on a stepladder, holding out a top hat at his arm's length, and she's kicking it out of his hand. And she said she could stand, as a young woman, she could stand on the floor with one foot on the floor and one on the ceiling. And so, and yet here was this, you know, lady whose, you know, mother was 5'8", which was tall in 1912, but not horribly tall. And her grandmother was about 5 foot. And here she was the daughter of people who were on the Titanic, and she was alive at the time and lived, you know, she was in London in boarding school when her mother was on the Titanic. And I was so thrilled when we discovered her here in California, that she was able to come to our convention and everything. And then she would, you know, go with me when I would give talks around Los Angeles. And so, you know, she was just absolutely lovely. And if she had been on board, she was younger just by days than Milvina Dean. So if she had been on board, which her mother almost took her on the Titanic, she would have been the youngest passenger on the Titanic.
So I remember hearing somewhere that the average height for a woman was like 4'11". What was like the average height for a man back then? Anyone know?
Well, I can tell you from my research, it's because I've been through this with people who are in the antique clothing and museum field, and they will tell you that people are no taller today than they were back then, because the well-to-do saved clothing, and the well-to-do ate well, and they were basically the same height people are today. Poorer people were shorter back then. And so it was around the time of World War I when they really started keeping track of the average height of Americans and everything. And so the average height, because now most Americans eat better, so the average height has grown. But what's interesting is if you go and look, there are a lot of passport records, even from 1912. Passports weren't required then, but maybe they were by certain countries. And when you look at them, and they're usually first-class people, a lot of the men in first class were around 6 feet. And I think Jacques Futrelle was 6'4". And how he slept in a bed on the Titanic in first class, I have no idea. There was no bed on the Titanic unless it was one of those, you know, almost double wide ones that could accommodate somebody who was 6'4". And I don't know how he did it. I don't know how he slept even in hotels. He was a very tall man, but it was very common if you were very well-to-do and you had been eating well for generations to be, as a man, 5'11", 6'1". That wasn't unusual then. I had one, just as an aside, I had some old clothing that my family had saved, and I offered it to the Wisconsin State Historical Society, where my family was from. And they said, "Is it everyday clothing?" And I said, "Well, no." And they said, "Everybody saved their best clothing. Nobody saved ordinary clothing." But I had my great-great-grandmother's wedding dress from 1859, and that was old enough they would take it. And then they would take my grandmother's graduation gown from 1908, only because I had photos of her in it and also the graduation program. But everything else, they were like, "No, sorry, your family saved those all those years, but we only want ordinary clothing," because everybody saved their best. So just, that's an aside.
So you were talking about the third class on the set. Every once in a while, we became the chosen few, and we got to go up and eat what we called the adult tent. With the cast and the crew and everything. And we also had people that felt sorry for us. And there was 3 or 4 of us. And some of the stunt guys would make trays of food for us and smuggle them down. And Ellen and me and Suzanne and another gal, they'd give them to us. And we'd kind of like go off in the corner somewhere so nobody would see us. So it was an interesting.
Working on the movie
situation.
was just the best time, and because one, it was such an unusual movie. I don't do Titanic movies every day, but just all these little things, like they had all those dummies everywhere that were articulated. They had skeletons inside them. And if you went to lift them up, you could feel the metallic joints so they could move them around. And I remember one time, because the only way to get up on the set was through that one elevator that went up the center that was huge.
Mhm.
And there was one time I was down there and it started to rain. And I went to get on the elevator and the doors open and they had stacked it with all of these dummies to bring them off. And you couldn't go up until they'd emptied it. So I just helped the guys empty it. And it was the weirdest thing because it was like hauling corpses
Yeah.
out of an elevator because and of course these, the Mexican workers, they were like dancing with them and, talking about how ugly this lady is, and stuff. And, throwing them on a truck. But, it was one of those things, you just look and go, wow, how often does that happen in your lifetime that you get to be around all these, sort of mannequins dressed like 1912. And then I got up on deck and there was one that was left behind and it was underneath the lounge overhang, which on the Olympic didn't overhang on the boat deck around the lounge windows, but on the Titanic it did. And there was one tucked under there. Well, it turned out it was an extra and he was napping. He crawled away to sleep, where no one would wake him up. And all of a sudden he moved and scared me. And other times they'd have them all wrapped in plastic, in garbage bags, which is just like body bags. I mean, it was just weird to see all these bodies all over the movie set. It was strange, just things like that were just, fun, but, different, things you don't think about when you think about them filming movies. And today, especially with Jim Cameron, I think, it was fun for him, because he said one reason he got to make the movie was so he could go dive on the Titanic and then got to rebuild the sets and everything. But today it would all have been green screen. It would all be CGI because like when you watch Avatar, there is very little actually on set filming in Avatar. And that would have been the same today if he were to do Titanic now. I don't believe he would have ever built the kind of sets he did. I think he would have done it all digitally, and it wouldn't have been the experience for the actors or people like me at all that we had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was amazing.
I've always wondered something about one of the clips from the movie. After Cal chases Jack and Rose down Grand Staircase during the sinking, they go past the dining saloon and like near the first class kitchen, I think, and they go down these stairs. And I was wondering, that hallway that they go down towards, is that like part of Scotland Road, or is that like anywhere on the ship, or what?
I think presumably it's Scotland Road, but I'm not sure that Jim really cared whether it was Scotland Road or not, as long as it was a hallway that worked with his script and, could make it exciting.
Was there like a hallway really there on the ship, or was it just like made for the movie?
Well, none of the interiors were actually on the ship. The ship exteriors and the deck scenes were all out, on the, grounds of the studio, but the interiors were all on sound stages. And so, and the interior sets were on these big, huge platforms, and they'd be like 3 stories high that could be lowered into a tank so that they could be flooded. And so if you were doing an exterior scene, like a launching of a lifeboat, you were outside on the big set. But if you were running down a hallway, you were on an interior set that was inside one of the sound stages. And so they weren't inside the ship at all. If you walked around to the other side of the ship, all you saw was scaffolding, because they only made one side, the side that faced the ocean. So you could have the ocean in the background.
Yeah.
Well, the bridge was complete.
Yeah, the bridge was complete. You're right. Yeah, Judy's right. You could go into the bridge. And if you walked in through a doorway, there'd be just a little bit of space before you were walking on planks. But that was about it. Yeah.
So was like on the actual Titanic, was there like a staircase down there, like just past those doors? Down to the hall?
I'd have to look at a deck plan and see, because I think there were staircases down from the kitchen, because a lot of the stores, the storerooms were in other parts of the ship, and some of them even far aft. And so there had to have been a staircase in the kitchen where you could easily get down to Scotland Road and get to where you had like, the different storerooms, because they were a little bit off site. I did a presentation at one of our conventions about dining on the Titanic. And of course, when I did that, I was more familiar with all the storerooms where because, you know, you had like even a storeroom for empty bottles kind of things. And, you know, one that was just for potatoes, and, you know, then you'd have like a locking storeroom that had the more expensive things, but then there'd be like, you know, a vegetable. And then there was one, you know, probably a cooler room that had eggs and dairy products, things like that. And so they weren't all right there in the kitchen. So there had to have been staircases there, but I don't remember exactly where.
I'm looking at a deck plan right now, and I can't really find much about like that area or where it leads. So I don't know, maybe not. There is an area like right down there that's alternative first or second class accommodation.
Yeah,
And
yeah, and it would
maybe
be
that
on the
was
other
it.
side of the ship from that, and then even towards as you head aft, because then you've got a separate galley for third class, which isn't anywhere near as big, that you still have to have access to all these storerooms. And what I think is interesting, one of the things, you know, several of the things when I did that talk, is that, you know, oysters are a big deal, and every night on the Titanic, first class had oysters as an appetizer, and they had a huge locker for oysters, keeping them cold and fresh. And then the other thing that always cracks me up, even though you couldn't get to it from the kitchen, adjacent to the kitchen, the galley, is the infectious hospital. And I always thought that was hysterical, even though there's no doorway between the two, but it's just funny that they would put the infectious hospital right next to where all the food is being prepared. And I just thought that was kind of comical. But obviously nobody was spreading diseases to the, you know, diners, but just an odd place to put it.
I've seen quite a few of those littered around the ship, like right there, like you said, and there's one I think underneath the port side of the forecastle.
Okay.
And I saw one by C deck on like the after like after the aft grand staircase on the starboard side, I think. And there's some stairs like right beside like right between where first class ends and second class promenade begins. There's some a stairway on the starboard side that goes down to another hospital like area. And it made me
Okay.
wonder, I was like, well, how many of these do they need?
Well, I'm going to say they needed as many as they put in there. You know, that's probably, it's all up to the designers to figure out. And that always amazes me, designing a ship back then, because, you know, and this is true of anything, like even a hospital or even a hotel or something, you got to really know what they need. You know, that's important. And how do you, you know, you have to understand everything an ocean liner requires at sea and at port or whatever, when you're laying out the rooms and everything. And one of the things Jim found when he was exploring the wreck is even some of the things labeled on the deck plans aren't what they turned out to be. And I know there was one room, and I can't remember what it said on the deck plan, but he sent a camera in there, and it was a pantry. It was just, you know, cupboards full of dishes. And so, you know, it had been originally designed, I guess, as something, but when they finished up the ship, they realized they needed dishes here to be able to maybe do room service to more easily or something to these people. But that's kind of true when you look in any building, you know, you just think, well, gosh, you know, all the things they need. And like, you know, today, obviously, if they had a third class, you know, on any ship, you'd have more than 2 bathtubs. But apparently in 1912, that was adequate. And that always was funny. But even by 1912, as they began giving passengers at sea more and more private bathrooms, the Britannic had way more private baths in first class than the Titanic did, because, you know, once people have sampled that, you know, then they want one every time. And of course, nowadays, every cabin on every ship that's built has its own private bathroom. You know, you don't have to go down the hall anymore. Back then, you took it for granted, you know, that you just went down the hall, and that was just the way you traveled at sea. Like being on a train, you know, you got to go down the hall and use the bathroom. So
Yeah.
it just, but times change, you know, they do.
And I've always been curious about something. The first time that you dove on the wreck with James Cameron,
Yes.
and you were there at the window and the side of the ship came into view, did it grab you emotionally, or was it more or less like looking at a slideshow, a scene in front of you? I'm just
Well,
curious as what effect it had on you.
the thing that amazed me when I first saw the Titanic, of course, in the movies and documentaries, of course, it's always the bow that's looming up, out of the darkness. And when we approached it, we came up on the starboard side, and suddenly there was this wall there, and Jim just said, "Don, there's your Titanic." And your porthole is only this big. There's 3 portholes. The pilot gets one about this big, and you get one about this big. And I'm really mean sometimes. I was just in Houston speaking. I think some of you know that. And I said, if you've ever been on the Concorde, that the hull of the Concorde, the jet, the supersonic transport SST thing, is so thick that it's like looking through a tube, and you can only look straight out. You can't look off to the side like you can with a porthole on a normal plane, a normal jet. And so that's what the submersible is like. You can only look straight ahead. But here we came up to the Titanic, and Jim said, there's your Titanic. And we just started rising up. And I've always studied the story. I Ken study the ship, so to speak. And I've never memorized every porthole the way Ken has. And he can tell you the circumference on each deck of each porthole and how many rivets there are. We know all this sort of, I'm, slightly exaggerating, but not by much. And we're going up, and I realized just looking through that little porthole, I knew where I was. And that's what really hit me. It's like, oh my gosh, we started, and then of course, it's kind of obvious at one point because we started going up past, I think I knew we were at E deck or something, but we got to the D deck and there were the doors or something. And then we got up to C deck and it was the Strauss suite. And then we got up to B deck and it was the Cardez's rooms. And so suddenly I not only knew where I was, but who lived beyond that wall, the other side. And I was like, oh my gosh, I know the ship better than I thought. Mm-hmm. Reminds me of a time I used to read Smithsonian Magazine back when it was thicker and more interesting, cover to cover every month. And they'd always, talk about artists and this and that. And the first time I went to, I can't remember the name of the museum, it's in Pasadena, but I went to this one art museum and I walked in and I saw a painting from across the room and I thought, that looks like a Degas. And I was right. It's like, oh my, how did I recognize a Degas from across the room? Because I had read all these articles or whatever. And so sometimes things sink into your head and you don't realize that it's in there. And that was my first, impression and my first experience with the Titanic was that, oh my gosh, I know the ship better than I thought. And the other things I remember is that, for all the documentaries we've seen, and even, the high def ones, it is more colorful in person than I ever recognized. Like the greens were more green, the, corrosion or whatever, and the rusticals were more orange and this sort of thing. The colors were a little more brilliant than you actually saw in documentaries. And of course, back then it was still film, in 2001, we were still using film. And then, but then one day, because I dove twice, and the one time I kept looking at things, and it's probably the first time, but this is where, like with Mrs. Snyder, that's the door she came out of when she came out on deck, because she said she walked out the entryway with her husband, and they just started walking aft, and they just happened to come to boat 7 when the first boat, when they started to load it. And she was the third person to get in. The bishops were first, and then she and her husband followed. And so, it's like, oh my gosh, that's the door that the Snyders came out of, and, this sort of thing. And then the next time I kept thinking about the victims. It's like, okay, well, that's where boat 8 was. That's where, Mrs. Strauss almost left. And, that's where the band played, is thought, and things like that. And, here's where the rockets went up. And I just, the second time I thought more about the victims. So each of them got their due, because I got to go twice. That was kind of my experience. The other thing that I had to remember to do, because with Jim, everything is filmed. There are cameras inside. It's like, you don't want to go to the bathroom inside the submersible because you're going to be on film. And so plus you've got 2 people right next to you. But anyway, so hold it if you can. But they had pee bottles. I know I'm getting on this, of course. But but we had monitors there. And of course, Jim, previous expeditions, they'd had cameras filming through the porthole. Jim had developed 3D cameras that were outside the submersible, out there in the water, filming everything and panning and, pivoting and everything and getting these great shots. And I kept wanting to look at the monitor. And then I'd have to slap myself and say, Don, you can look at the footage later. You can look at all of that back on the Keldysh. You should be looking out this little tiny porthole. And I'd have to remind myself, take advantage of seeing the Titanic firsthand. Don't get excited about what's out there and start looking at the monitor, because you can do that later. And so that was kind of, my experience down there was seeing it. But yeah, my very first experience was rising up the side of the ship and recognizing where I was, which really impressed me. Just through that little porthole, I could tell where I was.
What impresses me and what has always impressed me about you is your memory for detail and the fact that you can draw in this information about the Snyders and the Bishops and stuff and say that's where that happened, that's where they went. In older days when I was younger and had a little better memory, I could do that to a certain extent, but never approaching your ability to do that sort of thing. I can't tell you how tremendously impressed I've always been with your ability to do that.
Well, thank you. And I probably, the times that I am able to do it are what are impressing you. It's the times I don't or can't that I don't say anything. And I have to say, it's really interesting because I will forget something, and this just isn't the Titanic, it's just in general. But if I have what do I want to say? I can't remember who I wrote it to, but there was like a letter one time I sent to somebody, I think, when I was down on the movie set, and I had forgotten all about it. But once I'm reminded, then I remember it again. Yeah, bye, Judy. And then, but for example, on the movie set, I had forgotten until I read it years later, where I had written to somebody about it, that whenever there was smoke coming out of the smokestack, they had some little, call them smudge pots or something. And my eyes would start watering, even if I was like way down on deck, and the way up there, smoke's coming out of the smokestack, and whatever they were using to simulate smoke would make my eyes water. And I had completely forgotten that until I read it again years later. And now I remember it, this sort of thing. And I know a friend of mine sent me some letters I sent her back in the 80s, and I was reading them. It's like, I forgot all about that. I forgot all about that. And, but and yet now that I've read them again, it's like, oh, I remember that now. And now that I remember it, it's there, it's in the front part of my brain where I can conjure it up more easily. But so there are things I forget, but if I'm reminded later, they come back and they're there to stay. It's an odd thing with my memory. I will warn everybody here, so look forward to this, if I live long enough. Short-term memory loss is rampant in my father's side of the family. And so that's what I have to look forward to one day, is short-term memory loss when I'm elderly. Touch wood, I live to be elderly. So far, I'm headed that way, but that's what I have to look forward to.
You look very familiar, but I can't quite place where I've seen you before.
Well, it's funny how the Lynch family, we all have the same voice, we all have the same features. And, and there's a joke in the family, you can always tell a Lynch, you just can't tell him much.
I'd like to say a quick hello to Mark Baber. I think this is the first time we've ever met in person, Mark. Nice to see you and know what you look like now.
Yeah, Mark is our THS member too, so I don't know if you probably met him, Don.
You're right. You're right, George.
We met back
Last
in the
time I saw you was in the A&E documentary.
That was a long time ago.
It was. How are you?
Doing real good. How have you been?
I'm fine, doing well.
Glad to hear it.
Still writing White Star history.
All right, that's the way to do it.
Excellent.
Don, we've never met before, but we have exchanged a couple of messages on Facebook.
We have. Your name obviously is very familiar, and so it's nice to see you in person.
You too.
Yeah, I
And I
have to
have met-
remember.
And I have met Jill in person.
Oh, good. I know I have to
Yeah.
remember that I have to be nice to everybody because I'll meet everybody sooner or later. And so, because we all know that there are people on Facebook who will rub you the wrong way. And Lord knows, apparently I rub a lot of people the wrong way. And so, I'm sorry, but, take it or leave it,
Since I'm talking, I want to jump in and just echo what you said earlier about Phil Gowan. His work was amazing. I
Yes.
had an occasion to meet Phil on a number of occasions, and he brought with him his notebooks of photographs and letters, and was willing to share that information with anybody who wanted. He was remarkable.
Well, he really was. And, he and I would sit there like, we go to a THS event and maybe a bunch of us would go out to lunch. And the two of us would sit there and we'd gossip about the passengers like they were still living and in the next room or something. But I will say about Phil, now that he's gone, and this is no reflection on him much, but, he would hire sometimes, especially in other countries, he would hire a researcher to try to help him. And they would come up with photos of people. And I have a feeling that once in a while, those people had just gone to some thrift store and found a photo and then charged him for it because, I know occasionally he'd sneak in a photo that wasn't just a sort of, because people would copy his photos
Right.
without permission. And so I know occasionally he'd sneak one in, but apparently I think a few of those researchers he paid did kind of con him. And I'll give an example. Henriette Ivoire, she's an interesting passenger. She sailed 3 times in her life across the ocean. The first time she came over on the Empress of Ireland. She went back on the Lusitania, and then she was coming over again on the Titanic. So she sailed on 3 ships in her life, and the 3 worst ships. She wasn't on the other 2 when they sank, obviously. But he said years later, the researcher you suddenly approached him and said, hey, I found a photo of her, and sent a photo. And apparently somebody has pointed out the fact that, the clothing doesn't match her age kind of thing. And so, it can't be her. It's like she was, I think, maybe 30 in 1912. And they said the clothing is about 1912-ish, but this is of a much younger woman based upon the clothing and the big bow and the hair and all that. They said this is like a 12 or I'm not 12, but like an 18-year-old woman. And this isn't clothing that would have been popular when Henriette was 18. So I do think we got to be, I think Phil's information about people was good, but I think we have to be careful with some of the photos he came up with, because if he didn't get them directly from the family himself, you can't be sure they're really him. And this is actually true of some other people out there too. This has come up several times where I was in touch with Charles Hayes's granddaughter, and she told me, I have no photos of my grandmother. And she said, and my aunt, Mrs. Davidson, never left an account of her experience. And then after this woman died, suddenly someone came up with a photo of her grandmother that she had provided to them, and then a letter written by her aunt that she had provided. And I think it was convenient that Mrs. Haller was her name, had passed away before these things came to light. And I don't think she ever actually provided them to anybody. And so, this happens sometimes. We just have to be careful. As researchers, we have to be careful. We've all made mistakes, Lord knows, I have. But
Yeah, that's hard if you're trusting someone to do the research for you when you can't be there, obviously in a foreign country.
yeah, exactly. Because, Phil didn't speak French, so he had to hire someone to help. And apparently they found this woman's family, and they were not interested because they knew she had traveled with a married man, as his wife. And they didn't want to, her to be remembered for that. And yet then later this researcher comes up with a photo, which now we question the authenticity. So and what are you going to do? A person's over in France. You can't sue.
I'll speak French. I'll go and check it out.
Yeah, there we go.
Somebody had a good question here. And about Betsy, did you want to ask your question, Betsy? I saw there was one in the chat here.
I think Yvette has a question.
When you were playing Frederick.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Betsi.
Yes, the question was, well, I noticed that in the film you got to portray, by the way, can anybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay. In the film, you got to portray one of the passengers based on one of the photos. It's on the scene where Jack supposedly borrows the coat up on deck.
Yes.
Was it something that you've known that you were going to do, or was it something like last minute or by surprise by James Cameron to pick you for that role?
He did not pick me for that role. The casting people did, the extras casting people. I went in,
okay.
Ed and Karen Commuta and I went down there because they said, we don't know from day to day what we're going to be filming. And they actually said, they kind of, the hope was with somebody, I can't remember who, they kind of thought it'd be cool if in the smoking room scene, you just saw Ken and me in the background playing cards. Well, Ken wasn't available to go down and sit there because like I said, they had the outdoor set and then the interiors were all on a soundstage. And they said, if it's windy, if it's raining, anything, we're doing interiors. And so we don't know from day to day which portion of the script we're going to be filming. We just have to go with the weather. And so, which again is why today they would just do CGI. And so they said, you're just going to have to come down and suit up. And Ken wasn't available to take that many days off. He was working on some project. But Ed and Karen flew out. We went down there and, they got suited up and, and I was embarrassed, not embarrassing, it's nice. I don't know how to tie a tie, and I don't know how to button a collar or any of that crap.
Yeah.
And so, they assigned a guy to me and I think he was a little annoyed that I got to have a valet and it was him, William, whatever his name was, his last name, I don't remember. Who knows? He was the manservant. I don't need to know his last name. But anyway, so, he got me all dressed and everything and helped me in. And then, they just looked at me and they said, go stand next to that little boy. And I did. And they said, you look like you could be his father. Get up on the ship. And so off we go. And so we get up there and I didn't know what scene they were going to film. And we get there and that's the scene. And I knew that scene was going to be in the movie. And so I was all, wow. And then Jim shows up and he looks at me and he goes, because, they thought that the person whose coat, they just said it was going to be Arthur Ryerson. We didn't know at the time it was Edward Crosby because his daughter hadn't told me yet, his granddaughter, the lady we were talking about earlier, the tall lady who came to our convention, because she just said one day, my grandfather was photographed on the Titanic. And she said, you can recognize him because he had a hunchback. He had been injured in the Civil War and he always had this big hump on his back. And you look at the photo and that's him. And so we would have named him correctly in the movie had we known. But anyway, we just threw the name Arthur Ryerson at this other man in the photo. And Jim just looked at me and said, are you playing Arthur Ryerson? And I said, no, I'm Frederick Stetton. And so Jim, he was surprised. He didn't know it was going to happen, but it worked out really well. And the counterpart to that, well, it was fun. I mean, I used to give whole talks about working on the movie, and it took most of the day from like 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon just to film those few seconds, because they film it from every angle. And then, but always they have to film it so that the ocean's in the background. So when they wanted to film it from the other side, I had to then turn my hat around so the little bow was on the other side. And now I had to hold my gloves in my left hand instead of my right, and all this sort of stuff. And then, reverse your position. And so, so it doesn't really show that much on film. But anyway, then after we were all done, he was like, great, thanks. And I said, you're going to refilm it with somebody else? And he goes, I don't have time. And so, but when it came time to do the voiceovers, because, they record the sound at the time. And, but this is true of all movies, but then, they go on a soundstage because we were outdoors and you actually record it properly in a soundstage. And it's an interesting experience. And it was at Glen Sound, which if you've ever seen I Love Lucy, I think although they did their sound back then, it's still a studio up in Hollywood. And I got there and the guy said, Jim insisted that you do your own voice. And it's like, wow, that was nice. And so, but also Danny Nucci was in that day doing voiceovers. I think they said it took like 3 months for Leo to do all of his because he's, in most of the scenes. Gloria Stewart had been brought back to do something. And so I saw her that day. And I used to see her around LA. She used to do film retrospectives and I'd chat with her. And then Linda Kearns, who's one of the Irish ladies, and you hear her saying, oh, cool. But you hear Linda Kearns say Jesus, Mary, and Joseph when Kate stands up on her toes, on point, in that third class scene. And she was there. But, they have this thing where you hold, their earpiece to your ear and they play 2 beeps and then you start talking. And actually, and they said, I only had 3 lines on the set or 3 words, but Jim said, it's too quiet. So you have to ad lib. They said, Jim wants you to ad lib some lines and then we'll, dub when you actually see you speaking. So that's why you hear me before you see me. But where I'm going with this story is while I was sitting there waiting, either before or after I had done this and waiting to see if they're going to need me anymore, they started playing this over the loudspeaker, what I thought was like some recording. And it was a news broadcast that Princess Diana had been in a car accident. And I'm listening to this and I'm thinking that whatever show this is for, it is really tasteless. This isn't funny at all. And then it kept playing and playing. And finally I realized, oh my gosh, this is a real radio broadcast. That's why they're playing it, so everyone can hear. And so that's where I was the day Princess Diana died, I was doing my voiceovers for Titanic for that one scene. And I did have a second scene, but it did get cut. So that's what happens. But at least the nice thing about the Frederick Spedden scene was that it was pivotal to the storyline because that's when Leo steals the coat. So I wasn't going to end up on the cutting room floor, which was really cool.
Oh yeah, I got that picture too.
Woohoo!
I saw a question pop up that was intriguing about whatever mystery I think is cool.
She was
I don't know. I'll let you run, Jill. I'm letting you run it. I'm just saying I just saw something pop
No,
up.
I love when you jump. Charlotte was wondering in your research, what have you found to be the most intriguing mystery about the sinking?
Oh, the mystery. Gosh. In some ways there's so many, and in other ways, I'm just, I guess you'd have to qualify what exactly would you consider a mystery. A lot of mysteries are, who are the people? Like Edwina Trout carried a baby from Southern Europe, is all the man who handed it to her told her. And he said that the mother and other children were in another boat. So that could only be Mrs. Bucklini. Did she carry one of the Bucklini children? Like, who was the baby Violet Jessup carried? These are the kind of mysteries. When somebody would talk about somebody, like say Ruth Becker talked about the little foreign lady in her boat whose baby was in boat 11, who is that? Well, we think that's now Thelma Thomas because that's the only woman it could be. There's nobody else who meets the description. But then who was the man who translated for this woman? That kind of thing. And so there's so many little mysteries and so many of them are just about the people. Who was this person who did this? Somebody said, I saw someone do that. Who is that? George will, understand that because one of the people that I've always wondered about is like Robert Daniel. Colonel Gracie in his book put him in boat 7. And yet Jack Thayer saw him after all the boats were gone drinking a bottle of whiskey, and Thomas Dillon saw him on the stern. Well, what boat did he get picked up by? And in fact, when you really read through a lot of the accounts, I wouldn't be surprised. We always know that boat 4 picked up 8 people. And we know that boat 14 went back and picked up 3 or 4. Collapsible D picked 1 out of the water. I think that's it. I think those are the only people that, and then of course A and B floated off and thing. But there were so many people who talked about our boat pulled someone out of the water. I wouldn't be surprised if another boat, like say boat 12 or something, actually pulled someone out of the water. And the people who witnessed it never testified, because people in newspaper accounts said, we saw, we pulled someone out of the water. And yet, like at the British Inquiry, other than the Duff Gordons and Ismay, no passengers testified. And so if you were a crewman in boat 12 and someone on the other side of the boat hauled some steerage passenger out of the water, it really never made the record, so to speak. And so that's one of the mysteries too, to me, is like, do we know every boat that pulled people out of the water? Things like that. Then there, what music did the band play? I do believe the last song had to be Nearer My God to Thee, but then I also do believe that Autumn, or a version of Autumn, was played at some time, but not Song to Autumn, because nobody really said they heard that. But, it'd be nice to know exactly what the other tunes were that were played. We know a few that people remembered, like Alexander's Ragtime Band. If I sat around all day, I'd probably think of, 1,000 little mysteries like that. But so there's so many, there's so much left to learn. There really is. And we may never know it all.
Yeah, because people say, what is the fascination, haven't you run out of things to learn about? It's like, no, something new.
Well, bless, I can't say this because George told me it means screw you, but when you say bless his heart, George, I learn something new every day, but, George, this is where, I can throw a shout out to him, because George has collected so many accounts and studied them so carefully that he picks up on things that are repeated here and there, and, brings up things like even saying Nearer My God to Thee, when he really sat down and counted the number of people who actually said they heard it versus the people who said it, maybe it wasn't played or that Autumn was played or whatever. And it really tells you, Gesundheit, but but that sort of thing. And so in some ways there is a lot to learn, but in other ways it's sometimes there in front of us. And I'll mention this because it came up recently in a discussion some of us were having, but there are so many accounts that you don't always remember to cross-reference them. And, we've always kind of wondered, who was the man that Fifth Officer Lowe said was wearing skirts and he saw on boat 14? And Edward Ryan said that he put a towel over his head, like a steerage lady, from, Middle East or something, with a little scarf over her head, and wore a heavy raincoat, which probably was, maybe floor length. And he just got into a boat and they didn't even notice that he wasn't a woman, because he sort of had the scarf over his head and was wearing a coat, And just recently I came across an interview with Mrs. Fortune, who was in number 10. And she said there was a man dressed as a woman in a Macintosh sitting next to my daughter, Alice. And it's like, oh my gosh. And now, of course, some of the people were transferred out of 14 into 10. And maybe Edward Ryan was the man that Lowe said he thought was dressed as a woman. But in any event, here is a man dressed as a woman, and we now know what boat he was in. He even admitted he kind of passed as a woman. And so, these things, the information has always been there. And suddenly, I happened to notice both these two different accounts close together to remember them. And it's like, oh, look at this, they match, So, we now know Edward Ryan was at some point in boat 10, and he was wearing this raincoat that was, just like the man dressed as a woman next to Alice Fortune. So, things, we can still learn things, we can still figure them out. There are families out there with information that hasn't even been shared yet. Like I said, like when Andre Presley just suddenly said one day, my grandfather was photographed on the Titanic. And look at the photos that Father Brown took where we don't know for sure who the people are. I bet you their families know. When I met Carl Bear's daughter, and the Bear family had collected the photos that they appeared in, and that's how we know that that woman that the Harders is sitting next to isn't Mrs. Hayes, because she's not facing the camera. And so the newspapers just, I think, threw out the name Hayes, but it's Mrs. Beckwith, whose daughter was Helen Newsom, who was a friend of the Harders. And then there's another photo taken on the Carpathia of some people, and there's a girl sitting on the deck. That's Helen Newsom. And we wouldn't know that if her daughter hadn't told us. And so we're still learning, even in these photos taken on the ship and in the Carpathia, who these people are. And there's always stuff to learn. So.
And I'm sure you found this too, because I come across it a lot. The proliferation online of easily accessible newspaper articles has just opened up all sorts of lines of inquiry I've never even thought of. I don't have to go to the Rutgers library anymore and photocopy microfilm.
Yes.
There is so much online. And my focus is more on White Star's ships, than on Titanic or her passengers. But I keep coming across stuff now, even 20 plus years after starting this stuff, that I've never seen before,
Yes.
never heard of before. Some of it is bogus,
Yeah.
but like when White Star runs an ad in the Liverpool newspapers in 1870, announcing a ship called Majestic under construction, like an 1870s Majestic. I've never heard of this before, but there's much stuff out there, both newspapers and old books available through Google Books, that there's almost an inexhaustible amount of material. Some of it
It's-
helpful, some of it not.
It's absolutely true. And, you know, it's fun. And George Behe here is, you know, he can testify how many months of his life he has spent reading a microfilm reader, because George used to, in the day, go on interlibrary loan and get newspapers from other libraries from cities all over the country and scan them for interviews. And I remember I tried to do that one time with a newspaper, I think the Milwaukee newspapers, and the lady at the library just looked at me and said, "What does Milwaukee have to do with the Titanic?" And I said, "Well, there were people from Milwaukee on board." and so she didn't, I mean, as a librarian, she didn't understand research, but George did that for years. And of course, so many of those same articles now are available online, but some of them aren't. You know, some newspapers have not been digitized yet.
Right.
There are some, I love researching some of LA history, which is unrelated to the Titanic. And one of our best newspapers, it was the Los Angeles Examiner before it merged with the Herald and became the Herald Examiner, and it hasn't been digitized yet. And I just know there's tons of great stuff in it, because when I've looked in microfilm, it's a really good newspaper. It's comprehensive. And so, and another good example of that is someone years ago, I met Margaret Hayes, who saved her Pomeranian. I met her daughter once. And there was a gentleman there, and we asked her, "What do you know about your mother's dog?" And she said, "I really don't know anything about it." Well, then he went on Encyclopedia Titanica and claimed that she told him the dog's name was Lady, and that, you know, she kept the dog for years and even took it to the opera with her, you know, stuff like this. Well, but she didn't, you know, say that. That's not what she said. And turns out the dog shows up in Riverside, California on the anniversary in 1916, winning in a dog show, the Pomeranian division. And the owner claims that this dog was saved from the Titanic. And it's like, well, and so I started digging into that and come to find out that this woman, the owner's sister, was Margaret Hayes's bridesmaid, her maid of honor at her wedding. And apparently she'd given this woman the dog, who then gave it to her sister, who, because she had tuberculosis, moved out to the desert in California. And then there was even an article about the dog out there in the Riverside paper, and its name wasn't Lady at all, which is obviously this guy made up because the woman told us, "I don't know my mother's dog's name." And name was BB. And so, and then, you know, even researching it further, then about a year later, this woman, the owner, and her husband had gone back to New York for a wedding. And then in the New York Herald, there's an ad run by her husband that their Pomeranian is lost. And it's a reward if found. And that's the last we ever heard of it. So I don't know if they ever found it or not. But, and then this woman's daughter didn't know, or granddaughter, I guess it would be her granddaughter, didn't know anything about the dog or whatever happened to it. But she was interested to hear that her grandmother had owned a dog that had been on the Titanic. And so, you know, I would have never found those newspaper articles. I wouldn't have known when to look for them. You know, I just wouldn't have. And so, you know, it just, you know, these digitized newspapers have been a godsend for a lot of reasons. I mean, just, they're fantastic.
Juan, wasn't it Robert Daniels' family who told you that he was supposed to be the person who would release the dogs from the kennels?
No, it wasn't. That was R. Norris Williams said he met, I'm going to say, I've got this correct, I think it's from R. Norris Williams' account, where he said on the Carpathia, he met a man who released the dogs from the kennels because he himself owned a dog.
Yep.
And the only dog owner who survived, male, as far as I know, was Robert Daniel. And so that, I think, is where it came from, because Robert Daniels' family didn't say that at all to me.
Okay. I was, my memory, but I thought that you had talked with descendants of his and they told you that
No, the thing that I got from Robert Daniels' son, and he wouldn't put me in touch with the man, but when I first spoke with his son back in the 70s, Robert Daniels' best friend was still alive and he was in his 90s, and the son was in touch with him. And this man said, when Robert came back to Virginia after the Titanic disaster, he said he had swum away from the ship. And, that isn't something you'd tell your best friend, and lie about, kind of thing. And so he, that's that, and the fact that Jack Thayer and Thomas Dillon saw him after the boats were gone convinced me that, Robert Daniel did swim away from the ship. I just have no idea what boat he swam to. I just can't figure that out.
just another mystery.
Yeah, we may never know.
The other day we were meeting with George and in a little book club team meeting, and he was showing us his shelves and shelves of research in his closet behind him there. And talking about his research, and it's got to even be hard to keep it all organized.
Behind me are the two closet doors, and I got two bookshelves in there with all my photocopies and notebooks and stuff.
Mhm.
Sort of my research section.
Boxes and boxes and boxes of stuff.
Yeah,
And one of these days when I have time, I'm going to go through mine and purge it of all the photocopies I made over the years of articles that are now available online. Because I must have hundreds or thousands of pages of stuff like that.
Well, I believe it. I had an aunt who did genealogy for 65 years. And during COVID, when I was sitting at home, I went through 16 boxes of family history material she gave me. And I think I threw away 15 boxes of material because it's all available online. All those years that she worked and worked and worked and read microfilms and visited libraries and traveled the country doing family history, and it's all online now. I mean, I say that with, like it's sad, but I mean, that's what she had to do back in the 30s and 40s and 50s. That's what you did.
But isn't it nice to have the paper? So this is when people talk about the difference between having a book and having digital. Isn't it nice to have the?
It is, but you've only got so much space in your house.
the advantage
Not
of
enough.
digital stuff too is that you can search a lot of it electronically for word searches and stuff. So that's really handy.
Yes.
Because I've got 2 copies of On the Sea of Glass, and one of them I used to search up digitally.
No, and now we can search the inquiries so easily because, thank heavens, Bill Wormstead and George, you might have been part of that, who ended up typing them all
Rob
up.
Ottner's.
I'm sorry?
Ottner's played a big role in that.
Did he? Oh, that's right. That's right. Yes. And so it's all searchable now. And actually, I typed up some of the limitation of liability testimony for them for that project. And it's so easy to just do a word search because, of course, the British inquiry especially, how many thousands of pages is that? And it just goes on, and you'd never find what you were looking for otherwise.
We have a lot of information. It's a lot of research.
Yeah. Somebody else popped up with a question. I can't remember, but I'm letting you lead. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. I like when you're paying attention. All right, let's see here. What would be considered first and third class as far as employees?
Oh, we did that one. That was Caden's.
That one. Yeah. All right, where are we? Let me go down here. Sorry. Oh, okay. Caden is wondering, what is your take on where the band played? And George was mentioning this last night in the live stream. They were talking about, where the band was in the different areas and different times. And
Yeah, George is the expert. Yeah.
This is probably, he's wondering, about where you think they were and when they disbanded.
Well, my own research, a lot of people in the past, survivors that is, in newspapers, they said that they saw the band playing in the smoking room or the lounge or any number of the saloon, any number of half a dozen descriptions of vague descriptions, a lot of times, where the band started to play. But my own research has led me to believe that they went from their cabins and they got their instruments and they went to the top of the grand staircase, the forward grand staircase, into the reception area there. There was a piano in that room, and it was a logical place. And Richard Williams saw them playing in there. And late in the sinking, he and his father were walking around the ship, just sort of sightseeing, basically. And they happened to walk through the reception area there at the top of the grand staircase on the boat deck. And the bandsmen were in there playing all by themselves. Apparently all the passengers had left that area and were out, trying to get into lifeboats. And they were in there all alone. And it wasn't too much longer that he walked past that area again, and he noticed that the bandsmen had stepped outside onto the starboard boat deck, and they were playing their music there. And to the best of my estimation, that was around 2:00. The ship didn't have long to live after that, but they were apparently playing out on the starboard boat deck. As far as the music that they played, I've found a whole list of songs, hymns, popular songs and that. But I found 10 primary sources where letters that survivors wrote describing having heard Nearer My God to Thee with their own ears. And on the contrary, as far as the question of autumn or song, I haven't found any primary sources that mention that at all. There are occasional newspaper references to that, but for people to say, no, Nearer My God to Thee is just a legend, a romantic legend, that's not what the evidence shows. So that's my own take on the subject.
Well, it's very, very reasonable, because you've got the evidence there, and that's cool. I always, as fall back on Margaret Hayes, who was on the starboard side, and so she said autumn, and I do think autumn must have been played because, and the reason I think that is because she said that old familiar tune, autumn, which basically says I recognized it, that she was familiar with it. But for her to say it was the last one, no, you're right. Too much evidence that it, Nearer My God to Thee. And like I've always said, if you play Nearer My God to Thee, what are you going to play after that? That is sort of the last gasp kind of song. So, that's a good one. So I think she heard autumn, but I don't think she heard it was the last song.
I agree with that 100%. There, as you know, there's 3 or 4 perhaps other references. Harold Bride claimed that he heard it and stuff, but as you discovered yourself, whereas it had long been thought that newspaper article had been written by Harold Bride, it wasn't. It was, as you discovered, it was just a typical interview, newspaper interview, and you even learned, to my amazement, that the reporter who wrote that article later admitted that he wrote literature when he wrote that article.
Yeah.
And the word literature implies that it may contain some fiction. So, how much can we believe Harold Bride's account? I don't know.
And I always felt, and I realized that when I was writing illustrated history, getting back to the book of the month, but when you look at Harold Bride's New York Times interview, his testimony at the Senate inquiry and his testimony at the British inquiry, it's like 3 different people entirely.
Yep.
With all respect to what he went through, he wasn't the best witness, but he wasn't giving a consistent story between the 3. And you could see him giving maybe a story that kind of differed between 2 of them, but then the 3rd one being so far off. And so it makes sense that, the reporter had a lot to say and a lot of input. But what I always feel that that's true of a lot of 1912 newspaper accounts. I think the reporters have put a lot of their own, interpretation in them, especially with maybe people who didn't speak English very well, because some of them, the translation is so articulate.
Yeah.
And sometimes people give interviews and they don't match, what they said to another newspaper or whatever. And I think people give too much weight to 1912 interviews, even 1912 ones. I think you need to go with an actual letter written by somebody. And then even Colonel Gracie's account, and I hate to say this because of course my editor is still out there in the Titanic community, but Gracie died before his book was published, and we don't know what the editor did to the manuscript before it was finally published, because there were times with Illustrated History, and there was even a big blow up right at the end, where the editor had changed something, and he basically had put like a lifeboat on the other side of the Carpathia or something from where the Titanic went, something like that. I can't remember, but it was something that, real Titanic people would have picked up on. And I raised a fit about it and had to get my agent involved in everything. And they finally got them. They said, I think we negotiated. There were two things we wanted. And one of them, okay, you got to fix the hard fact. And it was interesting because, the publishers, until Ballard's book, they'd mostly done cookbooks and calendars. And I don't think they realized they weren't used to doing nonfiction. And so, and they'd even say, well, what about this? You said this. And they say, well, yeah, but that's fact. I have a source for that, and so, I kind of, had to fight with the editors with my book. And poor Colonel Gracie died. What if I had died before Illustrated History was published? It wouldn't be the same book it is. They would have had free run to do with whatever they wanted to make it read better. And I'm kind of making them out to be bad people, and that isn't true. I'm still in touch with them to this day. But, it's just that, they're looking at sales. And whereas, we on this side of it as historians are looking at history. And in fact, Ken and I even kind of went through that with Madison Press, because they felt they knew what readers wanted. And we felt we knew what Titanic enthusiasts wanted, what the public wanted to hear about the Titanic. This is our experience from being with the Titanic Historical Society and being, involved with documentaries and whatever, and, magazines. And this is our experience. And they're saying, no, this is what we believe readers want. And so, there is that butting of heads. And so even with Colonel Gracie's book, I can't take it at face value. I think there may have been some influence and some editing done to that book that Colonel Gracie may not have agreed with. We just don't know, because he died before it was published. And so that's my take. But in particular, I question 1912 newspaper interviews. I just can't always believe that they're 100% accurate, and that not only the reporter maybe changed something, but his editor back at the newspaper maybe changed something to make it read better before it went to press. And so we're always kind of struggling with the accounts that survivors left behind via newspapers.
There's a number of survivor accounts too, where in the New York newspapers, they give a lengthy interview with survivor X, and that survivor would get home and say, I never spoke with any reporters. I haven't told anybody my story yet.
Right.
So,
Exactly. I've seen that, where I think William Sloper was one of them. And then I think Washington Dodge was another one, and I think even Mrs. Dodge, was quoted. And I think he even said, my wife never gave an interview. And I think there are a lot of people like that. And that came up recently with some people who were talking, where Marjorie Robb, who many of us, well, of course, she's been dead for 30 years now, but many of us remember. And, there was an interview in one newspaper, with her and her sister. And then the same newspaper reported how the people who had met her and her sister at the Carpathia were not letting her talk to reporters. And yet here was an interview with them. And so
particularly in terms of New York, there were 8 or 9 daily newspapers in New York at that time, ranging from the rags that gave rise to the term yellow press, to probably the New York Times at the top end of the food chain. The Herald Tribune joined it later. But there were so many different stories run in the New York newspapers, not only about Titanic, but by everything else you can think of. And it just depended on the political or philosophical bent of the publisher or editor of the paper, that there's a lot of stuff in New York papers at that time that's just completely unreliable.
Yeah. And yet when the people got to their destination and the local papers interviewed them, you'd often get a much more reasonable account. And that's one thing that George did when he was used to get those microfilms from all the different towns and things, because, you know, there might be something in New York that was just sounded hysterical, and yet the people would get to Duluth and suddenly there was a much longer article because they were the only survivor being interviewed now, and it'd be much more detailed and it'd give you, you know, a better grasp of what happened to them and hopefully more accurate.
Well, so this is an interesting conversation because the book club team and we met and we decided we'd like to focus on more historically accurate literature, but I think it's very difficult because Samuel Halpern said today, you know, who's going to decide, you know, what's the, you know, historically accurate.
Yeah,
you know, very difficult.
that's why I always
if I can put in a plug for someone else's book, because it also coincides with a side interest I have in journalism. John and Vera Gillespie's book about, I forget the name of the reporter who was on Carpathia.
Carlos Hurd.
Carlos Hurd, right. The book was called Titanic Man. It's terrific.
Well, and George is on board RMS Titanic because you can't get a more original source than what the people themselves wrote. And, you know, he's collected all of these, and then it's up to you as the reader to make a judgment.
I'm running out of both shelf space and money for George's books.
Well, if you have to get one, that's the one to get.
People know that we're all accurate. George, you know, George puts a lot of.
Well,
I got that one.
Yeah, not everybody is a good witness. We know that. You know, I've known people where they could have something happen to them and they couldn't tell the same story twice the same way. And I think there are, you know, clearly some people, you know, we don't know that everybody on the Titanic had a good view of the Titanic going down. They might have had people in front of them blocking their way and the boat was too crowded to do anything about it. And, you know, but also they might have just been people who love to exaggerate and make a good story even better. One of the things I've always pointed out, and, you know, I hate to say it, but, you know, we always talk about Olive Molly Brown or Margaret Brown's actions in Boat 6. Who besides Margaret Brown ever said that those things happened? You know, it's like nobody ever said there was this lady from Denver in our boat and she got us all rowing. You know, the boat was full of these, and actually her great granddaughter Muffet Brown has even said, you know, there were a lot of strong dynamic women in that boat. And so, you know, some of these people, you know, I mean, we always admire Margaret Brown, and certainly she did great things in her life, and I have no doubt about that. But when it came to what was going on in the lifeboat, who besides her ever said those things happened?
So having collaborating witnesses
that is so critical, to have a secondary witness who will back up your story. And I wish there were some people. I was thinking of several people today. I was talking to a ladies group yesterday about ladies on the Titanic, and I mentioned that both Elsie Bowerman and Edith Pears had gone to the Wickham Abbey School, and I said they must have taught them at that school, you never document if you're in a bad experience, because we don't really have good accounts by either of those ladies, and yet they were schoolmates together at the school in England. And so, although I think I understand that Edith did write a letter, but the family has it. But in any event, you know, some people just didn't give interviews at all, and yet interviews showed up, you know, this sort of thing. And so it's it's something to take into consideration. We talked earlier about some of the mysteries. One of the mysteries that I've always fascinated by is when George and I first met Edith Haseman in her later years. And, you know, I asked her, she said she was in boat 14. And I said, well, what boat were you transferred to? And she said, I wasn't transferred to a boat. And so I said, so you went back when they picked up the bodies? And she said, yes. And, you know, and I backed off because it sounded awful. You know, here her father was out there somewhere. And her daughter said that when they were young, you know, their mother said how they would pick out a voice in the darkness and row towards it, and then it would die out before they get there. Well, every single crewman who testified said that they transferred all the women out of that boat. And yet here's someone who claimed she was in it. And there is a letter by another passenger who said that when they emptied out boat 14, she said, well, they emptied all the women out. And then she said, well, as many as they could. And so this one letter implied that not all the women were emptied out. And yet when Edith and her mother got to Seattle, they both gave interviews to the Seattle papers, and neither one of them mentioned going back where they were picking up people out of the water. Yet neither lady either mentioned being transferred to another boat. And so I absolutely believe Edith that she wasn't transferred out. I think that she was perfectly honest. She had no reason to lie to her children when they were young. Back then, nobody cared. And boy, I'd love to know who else was in that boat when they went back. And I'd love to ask if I had, you know, I thought it was a touchy subject, but I'd love to say, why didn't you tell anybody? Why was this not ever mentioned? Did they ask you not to say anything? But it's too late now. You know, I can't go back and ask her these questions today.
Charlotte Collier sort of implied that she was in the boat when she talked about the rescue of the Japanese passenger and stuff.
Yeah, and yet there were other things about Charlotte Collier that implied that she was in another boat. Like I think her daughter said that they were transferred out of boat 14. So, you know, we're not, what's going on with them?
Yeah,
You know?
another mystery.
Yeah, so these things that we'll never really know, all we can do is interpret and do our best guess. But I do believe that Edith and her mother were in boat 14. She was very specific that they were not transferred to another boat, and they went back and saw all these bodies.
So I was imagining you and George, you know, as like one of those crime investigators, you know, and they've got the papers all over the walls. I mean, how do you keep it all organized, and how do you cross-reference? And I mean, it's got to be a lot of painstaking work to
Well, it's a little easier now with computers because I can save the same file to each person's folder. But I used to, with my paper folders, I would write inside the folder, see also this person's folder and this letter, this date or whatever. But a lot of it's just up here. You know, George probably is better at it than I am. I think he's more organized.
No, not anymore.
Yeah.
Well, we've got a lot of binders.
Well, if I rely on that stuff, I've gotten to the point in my life, Don was talking about short-term memory a while ago. If I don't write something down, or if I don't have it, you know, recorded in an article or something in front of me, it's gone. I can no longer recall things like Don can do now. I guess my strong point is that I have the time, I guess, and the intention to go through one source after another. And for some reason, little odd details will stick in my mind. If somebody mentions a dog, for instance, in their account, I'll make a note of it in a notebook saying, Mrs. So-and-so mentioned a dog. And just using that as an example, one of the chapters in one of the upcoming books describes the animals, the dogs and cat and the other rats and chickens and stuff that were on board the Titanic. But I also, in addition to the 10 dogs that we know were on board the Titanic, I found vague references suggesting that maybe as many as 20 might have been on board. We'll never know because the reports are just too sketchy and stuff. Just one that comes to mind. We know that the Astors had their Airedale Kitty on board with them. There's no question about that. But after the Carpathia reached New York, Mrs. Goldberg said that there was going to be a dog show on the Titanic on Monday, and that the Astors had 2 dogs with them. So did they really? Did they really have 2 dogs? Was Mrs. Goldenberg accurate, or was she making a mistake?
Or was a reporter making a mistake? Well, I have
yeah.
a question. This came up on Facebook where somebody asked about the number of chickens, and you said you confirmed that there were 2 chickens and 2 roosters. Do we know that exactly? I mean,
I can give you the source that I got it from.
well, if you have one, that's
Hang
curious.
on.
I just assumed that Mrs. White had more chickens than 2. Wow, you do have the source right handy.
It wasn't the survivor herself that gave the information. I do recall that. Let me look it up.
Wow, look at
Go on.
this.
Talk
We have
amongst
lots of-
yourselves.
Researcher at work here. That's fun.
I know, because it's like when you hear chickens, they were in crates kept by the kitchen, by the, and all this, and the carpenter made crates for them. It's like, when I heard there were only 2, it's like, well, I would have thought there would have been like a dozen or something. My grandmother decided, my father grew up on a farm, and my grandmother decided that all the kids had to go to college. And so to help fund it, she was going to raise chickens. And so you mail ordered baby chicks, and she ordered 100, and it was just understood that some of them would be dead. And all of a sudden these cases of baby chicks showed up at the farm. And, and some of them obviously had died on the way or whatever, but they used to just ship them that way. And so she was going to be a chicken. And then sadly she died that year, so she never got to raise her chickens, but most of the kids went to college, so that was good. All these
I've
little
come
personal
across
stories that
all-
mean
I
nothing.
love that. It's fun. Go ahead,
I'm
Mark.
sorry,
I've come
Mark.
across I've come across all sorts of stories over the years about all sorts of animals being carried on White Star ships. Hunters bringing back tiger cubs who were kept in the butcher shop or the butcher store, circus animals that were carried on deck. Animals on ships was not all that uncommon.
They had to be shipped. Well, when the Hawk
Eh.
ran into the Olympic, that there were 2 Bengal tigers on board the Olympic.
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
The source that I got that the supposedly two roosters and 2 hens came from museums in Victoria, Australia, or a site called Museums Victoria in
Oh.
Australia, and I've got a website, but that's my source. They
Okay.
can easily be mistaken, but that's where I got it.
Yeah, it's funny with animals like that because they're not on the cargo list. And the cargo list, the original handwritten one, is very extensive. We usually use the one that was in the New York Times, and that wasn't all that accurate. And one of our members of the Titanic Historical Society, had gone through the cargo list and he's the curator of the collection at the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising. And he went through and looked for anything that would have been related to clothing, like feathers, things like that. But he ended up, getting all of the original handwritten cargo stuff. And he said, that transcription in the New York Times is pretty bad. And so it really is interesting to see the stuff people were shipping. And I love to talk about it because, it's one of the most unusual things I think in the cargo was one of the 2 engines from the very first airplane, which was not the Wright brothers airplane. They're the first manned controlled flight. This is a plane that apparently had a passenger, but it was controlled by the plane lifting off and then touching tracks that were up above it. And this, I think, was in the 1890s in England, and they were shipping to the Smithsonian one of the engines, and it's down there in the Titanic to this day. And the other one is in the Engineering and Science Museum in London. But, the stuff that's down there, and everybody makes such a fuss about Edwina Trout's marmalade machine that's on her claim. And her handwritten notes only says Sterling marmalade slicer. And so it's apparently, because I just assumed it was something that would just slice up orange peels. And that's what it said. So apparently it was like some little thing that was sterling silver that would slice orange peels. And that was what you would use to making marmalade a little easier. But who knows what it looked like. But as far
Wow.
as short-term memory, Winnie had a thing where, Ken and I asked her one time because we said, sometimes your short-term memory isn't as good and you don't hear as well. And this is when she was like 99 or 100. And she had it all figured out. And she said, I find if I eat well, I can hear and I can remember. And she goes, so I just have to be very careful about my diet. And as long as I'm eating well, I'm fine. And she had it all figured out at that age. So
Oh.
George, eat better.
That's a good book, the future book for you and George.
Yeah.
Little tidbits of advice from pet survivors, because then
Yeah.
reveal like, the secret to life was a kind heart and a sense of humor.
Oh, yeah, exactly. That kind of, well, Winnie used to always tell me, it was wasted advice, but she'd always say, always stay as sweet as you are.
Oh,
Her thing to say to me. But like I said, it was wasted.
I think you're a sweet person. So
I will say, in the book, I did hedge my bets. I said to be 2 chicken or 2 roosters and 2 hens.
Okay.
Because I wasn't positive myself, so I remember the posting the other day, and I did confirm that, and I shouldn't have. That was my mistake. I should have said it's said to be, 2 roosters and 2 hens.
Well, it sounds like it's the only count we have. So I'm okay with it for now.
Where they got it, who knows? Maybe
Yeah.
an imaginative museum curator or something. Who knows?
That's true. Yeah, I have trouble on Facebook getting people to recognize you have to get an original source. Pulling some newspaper article from 2 years ago and saying, see, that doesn't work. It's got to be an original source, and there's got to be, and we went through this recently with one person, very nice, lady. I think she's a member of the book club, about did Captain Smith run, the memorial or the church service on Sunday? And she kept coming up with these different articles that said he had. And I said, but that's not an original source. And I wasn't aware that there was one. And then George, you pointed out that Mrs. Casbeer said that Captain Smith held the church service himself. And so now we know. But so we have one original source. But other than that, it was just assumed that he had until that came out. But I'm big on original sources.
Well, yeah, 'cause
Really,
we-
it's the only way to go if at all possible. Because like
Yeah.
you say, there's so much garbage out there and people rely on the garbage. That's the sad part. They like you said, they'll find some odd bit or a posting that somebody posted 2 years ago in some forum, and here's my proof.
Yeah. Well, and if it sounds really cool, they want to believe it so badly. And the one that kind of frustrates me is one of the THS members from Michigan.
Uh-oh.
Not you, correct names, but he talked to Ruth Blanchard at one of the conventions, and she said something to him which he obviously misunderstood, because he got the impression that she didn't know that Michelle Navratil, who was in the room across the hall from her on the Titanic, had survived the sinking until she went to the 87 convention, and there he was. Well, the reality is she'd been corresponding with him for several years. And so she knew full well he was alive before 1987. And I suspect that she even knew in 1912, it was in all the papers. And yet she said something to this guy, and he misunderstood it and believed that she didn't know that he'd survived until she saw him at the 87 convention. And he's been telling people that. Now it's made it into a book. And it's like, it's like,
We
it doesn't
run into
reflect well on her,
we run into that on Encyclopedia Titanica all the time.
Oh my God.
People who have read about the various conspiracy theories and the Federal Reserve and the Jesuits, and some guy posted last week that the only reason to believe that Californian had a wireless was that they were involved in smuggling, and they were going to notify somebody when they got off the coast of Massachusetts to come out and meet them to take off whatever this smuggled material is. And a bunch of us are saying, what is your source for this? And it just figures, it stands to reason. I'm like, that's not good enough.
No. Well, and it's this whole thing about the switch theory, which came up last night on that one broadcast, is like, there is no evidence for the switch theory. There is none whatsoever, and people won't let it go. And it's like, but there is no evidence of it. There's none,
I don't know if you're familiar with Robin Gardner's History of the White Star Line, but he does something there similar to what he did with the switch, which says that in the 1870s and 80s, human trafficking from the Far East was a lucrative business, and therefore Thomas Ismay must have been involved in it. No source of any sort, but he labels Thomas Ismay as a human trafficker. Like, where is he getting this stuff from?
Exactly.
People grab it and go because they think, ooh, new research.
It's in the book. It's in a book. It's on the internet. It must be true.
Oh, I saw a YouTube video. That's all it takes. I saw it in a YouTube video.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh, that's what we're trying to work on. And I find it hard sometimes because some of these authors come into the book club and will send me messages. Can you make my book of the month? I'm like, ooh.
Well, I'm flattered you chose mine. And it's funny because, obviously after 30 years, illustrated history does need to be updated, but it wasn't self-published. I have no control over that. So if it keeps getting printed, it's just going to get printed as is. And there's nothing I can do, and Ken even said, well, what if they say they will? We should start working on it. And it's like, I don't believe him. And so I'm not going to do any work on an update unless I get an advance, because to be honest, I know there have been printings. In fact, there was supposed to be a special edition printed at the end of last year. I haven't seen any royalties in years from this book. And, so that's all I can say about it, because, and I know that's true of other books, because Madison Press isn't owned by the same people it was when they did illustrated history. The person who owned it then retired, sold the business to somebody else. And publishing is so limited now that I think that the person can't afford to pay royalties. And a number of us who, authors with Madison Press, we spoke to an attorney about it. And basically he said, you would probably spend more in legal fees than you'd ever get. So he goes, I don't think it's worth your time. And so all we can do is sit back, and then every so often, not so much lately, but I remember, say 10 years ago, I remember going into a bookstore in Southampton and there was illustrated history and it said it was a current, printing. I never saw it done, so, I can't complain about when I did make money from it, but there hasn't been anything in a long time. And so I'm not going to work on an update, but I will acknowledge it does need to be updated. There's no doubt about it, because it's over 30 years old and we've learned so much since then. And, different things I would put in it now, there were things I wanted to put in it then, but, we had editors. We had editors then. And so, but it is what it is, and I'm pleased and flattered that you've chosen to, make it your book of the month.
Well, yeah, because, it's not only your text and your research, it's also, Ken's paintings brought the light for everyone.
Well, and I have to say is that, obviously I love Ken's paintings very much. But I think visually, I really like Ghosts of the Abyss better. Only because I love then and now photos, and of course, Ghosts of the Abyss is 25 years old. But I love the then and now. Here's what it looks like today. Here's what it looked like in 1912. And Ken did a fantastic job with those. So to me, visually, I really, really like Ghosts of the Abyss.
Oh, so we'll have to put
the text is okay.
I even have one of these. One of them, I couldn't find it today, but it came with the 3D glasses. So
oh, yeah. I might have one of those somewhere. So I was going through the attic recently, and I found a whole case of illustrated history that had never been opened.
Oh, you can sell them to the book club. People are looking.
I know. I should just get on eBay and start selling them autographed or something. Who knows?
Because it's still a classic.
I can't understand why a publisher would refuse to update the book and yet refuse to give you permission to do whatever you want with it? What do they gain by sitting on a manuscript forever without, with that being all, just sitting on it?
Well, I think it's just the cost of making new plates, that sort of thing, because with the update, there's a lot of cost. And if you can sell it as is, he sells it as is. And I have to say, so, more background on me, since I'm the star today, but, I have a degree in finance, and for what it's worth, but, and I remember, and it might have been Illustrated History, it might have been Ghost of the Abyss, I can't remember, but the editors were like, well, do we want to put what these numbers would be today? Like, Mrs. Cardezza paid $3,300 for her suite. Should we put what they are in today's dollars? And I said, well, the minute you do that, you've outdated the book. The minute, like a year from now, those dollars will be different. But also the reality is like, you can't convert $1912 to today's dollars. You can do inflation, but inflation isn't a conversion. And I mean, I could go into a whole detail about, exchange rates. Like if you take inflation in England versus inflation in the US, and it doesn't line up perfectly, so you can't say that the 5-to-1 exchange rate back then would work today, all this stuff. And so whenever I read a book or even a magazine article, it says that would be so much in today's dollars, it was like, well, you've just dated that book, and it's, 5 years from now, it won't be worth as much. But also, it probably isn't really accurate anyway, because it just can't be done. But that's my little, personal thing about modern historical books, because they always give you what the current dollars would be. And then you kind of have to look and see if it's even a current book or not, because those numbers wouldn't mean anything otherwise. But anyway, Caden says that Dave has some questions.
Yeah, Dave, do you want to jump in? Yes, a few questions.
Hi, Dave.
He's not moving.
Yeah. We waited too long.
Thanks for speaking with us, Don. As always, thanks for sharing your time with us. Really generous of you, so appreciate that very much.
That's good to see you. It's good to see a photo of you.
Yes, the captain.
Yeah.
I'll get on in a moment or three. As I have it, you have been to the wreck twice, and Ken has been there 6 times. Is that it?
I know. Is that fair? No, actually, Ken deserves to go to the wreck more than I do, because he contributes value right then and there. Jim took me down twice, and of course, I said thank you because I was well brought up, and he said you needed to go to the wreck, which was really very kind of him. But part of his idea was with me down there, we'd be pointing at some place on the deck, and I'd be telling him what happened there, and it would be, then look good in the documentary. He was so focused on filming that just didn't work. But in any event, but Ken went down previous. He was on one of the expedition dives for retrieval. And I don't like to speak for him or anyone else, not publicly, but he didn't know Jim was going to be going to the wreck, and he thought if he didn't volunteer to go down on an artifact expedition, he'd never get to go. And so he volunteered his time for one of those expeditions. So he did get to go down there. But then Jim took him down more because Ken is very visual, and Lord knows Jim is, he's in film. And so Ken was able to contribute at the site, I think a little bit better, more than I was, because Ken knows the wreck. And so that helped a lot. And then I think Ken even went down in 2005. I can't remember for sure. We went back in 2005 for that live TV special, and I didn't dive then, but Ken may have on that expedition. But that's how Ken has been down there 6 times. He contributes, when he's down there, and you only get 3 people. One has to be the pilot, and one's a filmmaker. And it's like I always said, there's a little bench that's just like 1 by 3. And that's how much space you get, because in the center of the submersible, there's room for 3 legs, and the pilot gets to put both feet on the floor. And as Jim said, I get the 3rd space. And it's like, you brought me to the Titanic. You take as much space as you need. I'll just be over here on my bench and I'll be quiet. But anyway, that's how Ken got down there. And so I don't begrudge him obviously his trips to the wreck because he contributes. He certainly earned it for all he's done for the Titanic and all of his artwork and everything. So I'm happy for him. I'm also
Fair
happy
enough.
to go too.
Also, I was wondering about Benjamin Guggenheim, and are we knowing where he was actually in the ship itself, where the suite was or anything like that? Like what deck or number?
You want me to look and see real quick?
I can look it up, Don. I've got
Yeah,
that.
well, I've got I've got my hard drive. I have
Oh,
that
that's not
third
right.
proof passenger list. That would be the only way we would know. And if he's not listed there, oh, but his steward at the Senate inquiry told where roughly he would have been because he helped him put on his life jacket and everything. So
Stuart Etchies?
could have been, must have been. Yeah, so we do know. We have that information. George is
Yeah,
going to
man.
look it up. See, we're going to see, like, if he doesn't get sucked into the closet like the little girl in Poltergeist.
Not trying to play stump the
Closet
host.
open? He has the closet open.
I'm not trying to play stump the host or anything.
No, it's fine. What's interesting is what I think is thrilling for me, because, the passenger list that the stewards had, and there's 2 copies. One was found on Herbert Cave, and the other one was William Faulkner saved his, so his is pristine. And it's his third proof. I'm sorry?
They have them in B84 on that
Okay.
recovered list.
Oh, okay.
Good. So, Joe's comment. But there was a second proof, and obviously there must have been a first proof, but there's a second proof, which the Huntington Library got, and from maybe a travel agent or somebody in Massachusetts, a collector in Massachusetts years ago. And it has even additional names of people who had booked very early. And what's interesting is it has the person who booked the suite opposite the Strausses on the other side of the ship on C deck. And that's the one that was vacant when the ship sailed. It was for a Florence Pond, and she didn't sail. And so James Clinch Smith got upgraded from a little tiny cabin on A deck to a suite on C deck so that Edith Rosenbaum could have his room for her extra luggage. And it's funny, and Edith years later said in one interview that she'd been having an affair with Bruce Ismay, and maybe that's why she got that extra cabin and he got upgraded. And I think the Ismay family only said that Bruce did have an American mistress who was kind of homely. And so whether it really was Edith or not, who knows? But, you couldn't always trust what she said in her old age, in her 90s. So go figure.
Jim Clinch Smith, his family of Smithtown.
Smithtown, Long Island, yes. And brother-in-law of Stanford White. And there's other things too, because, okay, so he was also related to the department store Stewart family, who I think...
A.T. Stewart.
Yeah, A.T. Stewart. And I think A.T. Stewart was also related to Virginia Clark's second husband. But, all those families intermarried. All the first-class people were all related to each other. They're like the royal heads of Europe. They're all intermarried.
That was New York society in the 1890s, 1900s. Everybody's
Exactly.
related to everybody.
You always stayed in the social register. And it's funny, by 1912, like, for instance, Thomas Cardezza, one of the first-class passengers, his wife was a manicurist at a hotel in New York. Boy, didn't she snag a millionaire, by, doing his nails. And, so a few people kind of married sort of ordinary, but, one of the things, and it was very true in American society then, is if you were new money, you married someone from an old family who was maybe a little down on their luck, and that way they could marry money and they'd be back on their feet. And then you had their name, their family background. And so, like, for example, that's what the Allisons did. Mrs. Allison came from a very old family in America, multiple Mayflower ancestors. And she married this man from Canada who'd grown up on a farm, but who was a self-made millionaire. And so, he married up, she married up. And so that was kind of traditional in American society. And that's how, some of the families, did well, like Astor's, the Astors sort of married the Schermerhorns kind of thing, to bring up their good name, all that kind of stuff, that was traditional. And so.
The Ismays are another example of that.
Which one?
Both the Ismays.
Oh, yes.
Both Bruce Ismay and Bauer Ismay married Schiffelins. The
Yes.
Schieffelins were very prominent. I've got all sorts of articles about the Ismays being at social events with Rockefellers and Fish family. The Ismays were tied into New York society to a substantial degree.
Yes. Yeah, then that's where I'm trying to think of there's another great example, but I think Cornelius Vanderbilt, who married Grace, can't remember her maiden name, but her family came from some money, but boy, they were going to marry their daughters to well-off people, and they married Grace to a Vanderbilt. And so between the two of them, they were society, because it took the Vanderbilts a little while to finally break that New York barrier kind of thing. That yes, New York society and Philadelphia society too, fascinating, backgrounds on the people. And apparently, according to the Widener's nephew, they were not socially acceptable in Philadelphia, even though they were the richest family in all of Pennsylvania. That was his take on it. They really weren't welcome in the best clubs, that sort of thing. But of course, today we think of Widener and it's like, oh my gosh, Widener's.
Fish is definitely an old New York name. And I believe a lot of that wealth came from somebody who was childless and wanted to just give his money to some family friend, and that family friend, somehow the wealth came on from there or something like that. But yes, it's an old name with a lot of pedigree there.
Well, the Stuyvesant fish.
Dave knows more about New York than I do.
We all know stuff.
Titanic tour in New York City. I'm not sure if you heard of Dave Gardner's Titanic tours, but it's a pretty fantastic tour.
Thank you. Well, you may recollect that we had just passed the apartment of Alec Baldwin that I pointed out, and he had a couple tie-ins. And I even said that they shared the same birthday with Jim Clint Smith of April 3rd. So
cool.
There's always a way.
Yeah.
Which is also the anniversary of the death of Peter Cooper, who I mentioned earlier on. So, it's just stuff you can do. But back to New York, I was also curious about the World Trade Center, especially if there was a victim on 9/11, but anybody in general. Are we aware of anybody that might have been descended from any Titanic souls? Like, was there any bloodline of Titanic people that went to work in the World Trade Center or was involved in it in any way, maybe even building it?
I am not aware of any at all. You'd think there would be, because almost everybody, my father had a cousin who was on one of the planes. So you'd think there would be some connection, but I'm not aware of any. I've never heard of one.
I'm on the other side of the river from you, Dave. I've never heard of that either.
Okay. Just kind of figuring, if anybody's heard a thing.
Yeah, it's funny how because sometimes, like I said, they come up in the odd places. Because like I mentioned, the actress Amy Hathaway, her, great grandmother was on the Titanic. And then I think Brooke Shields? And then somebody else, there's some other actress, and they're related to people, just, like a great uncle or something, or great granduncle. There are other people in Hollywood that we see in the movies who had relatives on the Titanic, which, but they don't exactly make a big deal about it, kind of thing. I can't remember who the other one is, but they're both related in some way.
And musically, King Princess is a Strauss family member. She played Saturday Night Live once or twice.
Yeah. Well,
and the Jimmy Fallon show.
Walter Clark had 4 grandsons, I think. And I talked to a member of the Clark family, and he said the only one he knew of, was one who ended up in Portland, Maine as part of the Portland Symphony. And, because none of the grandchildren ended up living in the Los Angeles area like the grandparents had. But, people move on, it happens.
That handsome baddie in Live Free or Die Hard, he's in a couple of TV shows too. He is a Vanderbilt family member.
Oh.
He's the really super villain in Live Free or Die Hard, the one with Justin Long. He's the real handsome guy. He sweeps the stuff on his desk when he gets mad, and he does that model pose. I can't think of everything but his name, but he's Vanderbilt blood.
Huh.
Who's that guy? Son of a gun. Think of it in a moment. Maybe Justin or something. Starts with a J. But anyway, yeah, people find their place.
Yeah. Well, I always speaking of the Vanderbilts, because of course, George Vanderbilt had his valet in second class on the Titanic, and Edwina Trout knew him because they were both from Bath and they were both the same age. And I regret that I never asked her, what do you remember of this man? Because I didn't know. Years later, people would want to know. And I wish I had asked her, because all I know, like, she didn't hang out with him, but she knew him because she said she ran into him during the sinking and, met up with him at one point. And, they said, probably hello or what's going on or something. But I always wish now that I'd said to her, well, how exactly did you know him other than just being from Bath? And why did you not socialize with him on the ship? I just kind of wonder what was going on there. But too late now, I can't ask.
Now, if you're still indulging me.
Sure.
Also, we had been talking about Margaret Brown,
Yeah.
and I recollect stories like she helped the Sinai Miriam Cantor at the Russian consul and a few other things. And I know she's spoken some languages, like a handful. Do we know, like I figure French, maybe she was in France, so I'm assuming Russian. Do we know how many languages she had been? It was like a half a dozen, right? Or just a few?
I don't know how many she spoke. The standard languages you learned in school, if you were really well brought up, were obviously Italian, German, and French. Those were the European languages that were the normal ones. Today they throw Spanish in there, but then maybe Latin. But those are the ones most people learned. And in fact, it was funny because, Michelle Navratil would come to the Titanic Historical Society conventions. I didn't speak French, I little high school German, and I mentioned to him that I'd studied, German for 4 Jahre, and didn't, speak any French, never studied French. And he said, "Oh, ich habe es auch studieren." And he starts talking to me in German as if I understood him perfectly. And it's like, great.
Yeah.
But then at one of the conventions I went up to, Eileen Lennox Cunningham Schaefer, who was a cross-channel passenger and obviously grew up very well and very well educated. And I said, "I'm sure you studied French in school." And she said, "Yes." And I said, "Would you please speak to Mr. Navratil?" And she said, "Well, I'll try." She goes, "I haven't spoken it in years." And so she explained to him that she spoke it, not very well, and she would do her best. Well, as he could see that she understood, he started speaking faster and faster. And then by the end of the conversation, she was just smiling and nodding. That was about it. But it was nice of her to give it the college try. That was great. But no, I don't know what languages for certain Mrs. Brown spoke. But I think, this woman that she was helping, if it was Miriam Cantor, I can't remember who, because they said they interviewed, Mrs. Brown on the Carpathia. She hadn't gotten off yet, I think, or either that, she'd taken the woman to the hotel with her or something. And so I think the woman must have spoken something other than Syrian for Margaret Brown to be able to communicate with her at some level. But I mean, Margaret Brown was a very intelligent woman. She just, but she was self-educated. She, I think most of her education came as an adult. I mean, she'd gone to public school, but, her writing skills weren't great. But, when she came into money, and traveled, she learned, things, which can't say bless her heart, but she did. I mean, I admire her very much. I just know that she was kind of a storyteller, and I'm just curious. I was always curious as to whether she really did know the Astors or not. But apparently somebody had researched, and they did a YouTube video, because she didn't sit with them on the Titanic at their table, and yet if she was traveling with them, and yet this person had gone through all her letters and things, and I think it was a couple, a man and his wife, and they had sort of traced her Egyptian tour based upon all her writings. And apparently it did come across in the writings that she was with them. Now, how much she was with them, I don't know, because I've never been able to find anything. And we were talking earlier about, being able to do searches in newspapers. And I've punched in like Astor brown, you know, in the same search to see if like there was a party that they were both at, and I've never found anything social that they ever both attended. And yet here she wrote a letter home from, you know, Egypt that I'm here with the Astors. And how, when she says with the Astors, does that mean that they're further up the aisle on the train, or is she actually, you know, taking the same tour they are of the pyramids? I don't know. And yet apparently they did cross paths a lot, you know, apparently according to this person who had researched them, but I've never been through all the brown papers that they have, so I can't swear to it.
Okay. And also just to go back to what you were saying about something else, to agree in a way about the sources and how they get corrupted over time. Victor, I guess you'd say Giglio or something. I don't want to pronounce it wrong, but he was a secretary to Benjamin Guggenheim. And then seems like Walter Lord simply redesignated him to being a valet. And we just can't quash that. It's like playing, you know, what is that? It's like we just can't squish it, and everybody still they just keeps whack-a-mole. Thank you. It's like playing whack-a-mole, and we just can't take that valet thing away. And
well, it's hard, and I wonder if he was entirely a secretary. I know that one of the stewards, there's an interview where he mentions Victor, and he sort of attributes him with the quote about dressing up, you know, and where he said Victor was the one who said, well, we have to look our best, you know, something like that, which, you know, has been transferred to Benjamin Guggenheim. And so I'm not sure, you know, maybe they both said it, but Victor did come. Jeff Whitfield has taken me around to where Victor came from. And apparently Victor's family was reasonably well off. He was from Liverpool and he'd been privately educated, things like that. And then the family sort of disappeared at some point. And so, you know, from Liverpool, where they went, I don't know. So it might have been a nice way of saying, you know, that he's more than a valet by saying secretary, but I'm sure there must have been some valet duties. You know, I'm guessing, I can't swear to it, but, you know, he traveled with Guggenheim quite a bit. And so you have to wonder, like, for example, Mrs. Douglas's maid wasn't really a maid, even though it says that on the passenger list. She was a hired traveling companion, especially because when you're in Paris, if you don't speak French, it's nice to have a hired companion who will, you know, go to all the museums with you and translate all the descriptions and things. So, you know, I'm not sure what his full, I'd have to look at Peggy Guggenheim's autobiography because she had a big crush on him. And so I know she talks about Victor. So I don't remember what she says his exact capacity was.
Okay, thanks. And just one more thing, since we're talking about Liverpool, I've known for a long time in the 1960 Hunter Davies book about the Beatles, I think it's simply called The Beatles. Even back that far, I'd seen a reference that George Harrison's dad worked for White Star, like some kind of a steward or something. I see that every once in a while, but I've never been able to pin down any vessels. Have you ever heard of any names of any ships that he may have served on?
No, I haven't. I have a friend out of Seattle who does Beatles tours. I'll have to ask him if he has any information about it. Although I would think he would have told me if he did. So, but no, I don't know what ships Harrison's father would have served on.
Okay.
And that would be a tough one to figure out because Harrison is such a common name. So
yeah, although, you know, the Ancestry has a lot of crew lists for ocean liners, and it's kind of interesting to see them because Ancestry.com, because, for example, there was this man who pretended to be Charles Burgess, and Walter Lord even quotes him. And yet you find him on passenger lists with other Titanic survivors. And so like Walter says in his book, you know, Charles Burgess may be the last crewman still working at sea. You know, he's serving on the Queen Mary. Well, if you go to the passenger list from 1956, or the crew list, I mean, there's Harold Phillimore, who was pulled out of the water by Boat 14 on the same page. And so I think that's where Charles Burgess, or this Reginald Burgess, got the idea to become Charles Burgess, because he'd actually worked with other survivors and it was really cool. And so he wanted to be one or something. But so if you know what Harrison's father, roughly his age was and everything, we might be able to find him on some of
Yeah.
these crew lists if he was sailing in and out of New York.
And
Usually,
Dave, some of the Ellis Island ship manifests have the crew included in the searchable function. Some
Wow.
don't, but there might be something there.
the crew for going back. Okay, could be helpful too.
I
Yeah.
found captains and things like that. It's not uniform, but some of the manifests on the Ellis Island site include crew.
Wow. Next time I'm out there, maybe I'll do
You
that
can
as my
you can do it
focus.
online. You can, Ellis Island website is free. You don't have to subscribe.
Yes.
You can just sign up and you look at it online.
Okay. Yeah, I think usually 1930s was referenced when it came to George Harrison's dad. So it was after Titanic, but I think I've usually heard something about the 1930s in that context.
Yeah.
Thanks. And thanks
Sure.
again for speaking for us tonight with us tonight.
Hey, my pleasure. I'm
Jill.
having a good time.
Yeah, this is awesome. I just had a friend send me a text, my friend Chris Shepard. George has related a deeply moving story several times about a steward taking a passenger under his wing and giving her his own life belt from his own room and told her, if you're saved, pray for me. Do we know who those people were and what happened to them?
Well, the woman and her children, it was Minnie Couts and her two children, William and Neville. Was that the second one?
Yeah.
Nobody knows who the crewman was, unfortunately. I don't suppose we'll ever know.
I just wanted to help someone.
Yeah, I wish there are a lot of stories like that where I really wish we knew their names. And, sometimes they might have mentioned their name and the person forgot, this sort of thing. It'd be wonderful if we could put a name to every person in every story.
Absolutely.
Once we perfect time travel, we'll be able to answer all these questions and more.
Yes. Uh-huh.
Oh, that's true. That would be neat. So many questions. I'm just gonna look at the book club ones.
There was a guy years ago, and George was in touch with him too, and this is probably 30 years ago. And he was very secretive when he first contacted the THS and me and whatever. But he was in touch with somebody who they basically telepathically could go back in time. And they were coming up with all kinds of information about, that the captain had been a morphine addict and he had his own private nurse and this and that. And, and I guess he went on one of the, groups online before Facebook, like a Yahoo group or something. And boy, he got shot down quick. But he was annoying, but I was apparently annoying to him because I wasn't buying it.
Someone here asked Jason Reno. First of all, thank you for engaging us. What is a story about a lesser known survivor that you find interesting? And then he had another question after that.
Oh my gosh, I've got to think. I think that was on the list you gave me, and lesser known survivor. Well, I think actually we talked about that a little bit. That Edith Haseman. I mean, we know her. I didn't, because we knew her, literally knew her, and she lived to be over 100. But she doesn't appear in a lot of books. I mentioned her once in Illustrated History, where she said in the morning that it was hard to believe that something the Titanic's size had ever even been there at all because the ocean was just big and empty. But her lesser known story is the fact that she was in boat 14 and went back when they pulled people out of the water. And then someone asked me one time, who's your favorite crew member? And one of the lesser known stories that I appreciate, because it kind of ties in with her, is Harold Phillimore, who went down with the ship. He's like 25, 26 years old, and climbed onto, he said, a piece of staircase. And there's talk that maybe the staircase, actually, the main grand staircase, had sort of like it did on the movie set when they flooded the set, and it broke free, and they think maybe that's why it isn't down there at the bottom of the stairwell, that it broke free and floated away. because he said he was on a piece of staircase with another man, and the other man eventually just said, "What a night," and rolled off and died. And Harold Fillmore was all alone there in the dark, and he kept screaming and screaming and screaming. But Edith Haseman said that they kept listening. They'd pick a voice out, boat 14, because there were so many people out there in the darkness, and they just pick one voice out that seemed louder, and they would row towards it, and then it would die away before they could get there. And then they'd have to pick another one. And so they only ended up with like 3 or 4 people. It's kind of debated whether 3 or 4, but probably 4, because we know Harold Fillmore was one of them. So that sitting on that, or kneeling on that piece of staircase, whether it was like a ladder kind of staircase or a part of the grand staircase, saved his life because he just kept yelling and yelling and yelling, and it worked. And so Edith Haseman doesn't get as much due, I think, in books and things like that. And, and she was a lovely, lovely lady. I mean, just, really a sweet person. And she really would try and, remember everything she could for you. And then Harold Fillmore, I think died in 1967, but the THS has letters from him where he describes this. And they did an article a couple of years ago where they mentioned all this. I think I wrote it. Those are some of the lesser known survivors who have really great stories. I'm sure that there's so many others, and it's funny how even little tidbits will like tug at me, and I quote them a lot. Like what I enjoyed about knowing Edwina Mackenzie was that she was an adult. Most of the survivors we knew, if they weren't children, they were traveling with somebody. Like Mrs. Snyder's husband booked their passage, this sort of thing. Marjorie Newell's father booked their passage, and here was Edwina Trout, who was traveling alone. And one of my favorite quotes is a letter she wrote to her parents on the Carpathia. And she says, "We are sleeping like a lot of dead things all over the ship," because just every square inch of the Carpathia, I mean, she slept on a table for several days on the top in the dining room in second class. And so, there are just some of these little snippets that I think are just, wonderful. And recently an account came up, I think Mike Poirier found it, by Ruth Becker's mother, which was really interesting, where she said, "We worried when morning came that the children would wake up and expect to be fed. And of course, they're in a lifeboat. How are they going to feed their children? Children don't understand that. Her children are 1 and 3 or 1 and 4. They don't understand this." And so, there's a lot of these little snippets, and some people would just remember something that would stick in their head and would always be part of their story, whereas many things happen to them, obviously. And so those are the things that kind of, grab at me every so often. You see, something that just, like, I always remember Mrs. Becker said in one interview, "The sinking of the Titanic will be my lifelong nightmare." And it really was. It was always her nightmare. I mean, just her grandson said, you couldn't ask her to talk about it. She'd try, and then she'd start crying. And so, there's just, everybody has some little snippet to their story that even if they were very ordinary people, that really is very meaningful, or some good quote or something like that.
On that strange account that you mentioned a minute ago about Captain Smith and this and that, I was in a thrift store not long ago. I don't know if you're going to be able to, well, it's reversed.
Oh.
Anyway, I don't know, you probably remember from years ago, a guy named William Barnes claimed to be a reincarnation of Thomas Andrews.
Mm-hmm.
Well, this is a couple of cassettes where he's interviewed. I haven't listened to him yet, but
You
got
had
some
to buy
listening in store for me.
it. Is that your recreational listening?
When it's funny, I mentioned about the THS, and the letters they would get. And, obviously every so often they get a letter by somebody saying, "Well, was there anybody on board named Sally?" And this kind of stuff. And where they're going. And one lady even called me one time and she said, "Well, are you sitting down?" And I said, "Is this going to be a reincarnation story?" And of course it was. And it's like, I mean, how many reincarnations of Thomas Andrews can there be? It just, and so everybody wants to have gone down with the Titanic in a past life. And I'm not going to say, it is or isn't true. You know, it's like they're like ghost stories. You know, we all love a good ghost story, but I'm not going to be the one who says that ghosts exist or don't exist. You know, we all love a good story. I'm just glad my house isn't haunted, you know, that kind of thing. I mean, I live in
And
an older
all,
neighborhood. Well, there's still time, you know. Well, actually, I'll tell you, I'll say, here's a little story that's off topic. You've all seen Transformers. In the original Transformers movie, the house that Shia LaBeouf lives in is like 4 blocks over from here. And I actually looked at that house when I was shopping in this neighborhood, and it needed too much work, and I wanted one I could just move into. Of course, now mine is decayed around me. But when the people bought it, the owner was a 90-year-old lady living in New Orleans. 13 years later, all of a sudden, they have a poltergeist. But they were in touch with a nephew of the lady, and they went and asked her, and because the housewife even said, I can't keep chocolate in the house. Like if I bake a cake, I come back later and the frosting's all scraped off. And so she went and she asked the nephew, said, I want to ask you about your aunt. He goes, yeah, she just died. She was 103. She goes, did she like chocolate? He goes, yeah, she was a chocoholic. She goes, I think she's in the house. And so that's the house that you see in Transformers. So, you know, like I said, we all love a good haunting story. You know, I'm glad my house isn't haunted, so I don't have to decide whether ghosts exist or not. But here are these poor people, they lived in their house for 13 years before it became haunted. So it's just, anyway.
all of the reincarnation people that I've ever come across have all been officers or first-class passengers. Nobody's a third-class passenger. Nobody's a steward. They're all somebody very prominent about whom there's a lot of information available.
And I've known one person who claimed to be, I think it was a fireman. And then there was somebody one time who claimed to be a child, but the problem was they remembered things like a playroom and stuff like that that just didn't exist. And apparently, and I know Brian Ticehurst over in England was also in touch with this person. And boy, this person got so mad that we wouldn't confirm that his memories were accurate, and they weren't accurate. And you know, he even came up with a name, but it wasn't somebody on the ship, whatever. And then he remembered a playroom, and there wasn't one. But he was just a child who'd gone down with the ship, and he just was livid that we wouldn't confirm that he had been on the Titanic, but he just claimed to be one of the children who died. So there were having a few, you know, but you're right. You know, everybody wants, it's like everybody wanted to be Napoleon back in the old days. And, you know, I always say, you know, I've been quoted about it, but that, you know, everybody wants to have gone down with the Titanic in a past life. No one ever wanted to be hit by a Packard in the parking lot of a supermarket. You know, it's just, no one wanted to die in their bed, you know, just.
Or be a relative, you know, related.
Yeah.
Like, you want to be related. Somebody was asking about dress during dinner. We lost the question.
Oh yeah, they asked about dressing on the first night. The first night on board, you don't dress for dinner. And usually not on the last night either, because the presumption is on the first night, you haven't had time to unpack. And on the last night, you've packed your good clothes. So the first night and the last night at sea, you were not expected to dress for dinner.
So it was more accurate than in the 1953 Titanic.
Yeah, I was trying to think of what they were wearing in that. It's funny because, you know, Violet Jessup, when they interviewed her for A Night to Remember about what people wore, and then when she saw the movie, she was horrified that ladies in the dining room were wearing outdoor hats, because you didn't wear the big broad brimmed hat indoors that would keep the sun off your neck. You know, that was, you know, you wore the, you know, a more subtle hat if you were wearing a hat at all indoors. And she was horrified when she saw in the movie, which after only, you know, I mean, even in the 50s, ladies still wore hats. And yet they, in the dining room, they had all these women wearing outdoor hats.
Did Austin want to add something?
Yes, Don, it is so nice to meet you. I'm a major fan. I have followed you for years. And
that
so
was you? Incredible. Oh my gosh.
So you're one of the first faces I remember when I was in the 4th grade when I first came across the story of the Titanic. And I just couldn't get enough, and I kept watching documentaries and getting books. And I remember seeing you and reading about you so much. So it's honestly like meeting a hero of mine. You know, I've grown up reading about you and what you have to say about Titanic, and it's just been wonderful. And you made a big impact on my life, and I just wanted to say thank you. So
Well, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it very much. That really makes me feel good. You know, I'm human. You know, I need a pat on the head once in a while. So thank you very much.
And my question for you is, have you ever considered writing an autobiography about yourself and your adventures, your dives, all of that?
Well, you know, people do need things to put them to sleep. I've always been a really, frequent letter writer and still am. And I wish, people had kept all my letters because, I go into great detail or whatever. And actually a friend did send some back to me recently. And they were when Ruth Becker Blanchard was dying, and another THS member, a friend of mine, Daryl Rooney, and I were going up and helping her daughter sort of take care of Ruth. We're really helping the daughter more than taking, because we weren't caregivers, obviously. And I had just forgotten how much time we had spent up in Santa Barbara helping Jean, when she needed help because she was taking care of her mother in her last weeks. And this friend sent them back to me, and I even photocopied, those parts and sent them to Daryl and said, wow, I'm really proud of us now. And I look back and think, my gosh, there are so many things in those letters that when I, read them that I completely forgotten. And, I wish the people I'd written to over the years had saved all my letters and sent them back, because then the autobiography would write itself. But in that respect, no, I don't have any plans to write an autobiography. I do think I've had my moments, like diving to the Titanic and working on the movie that I think were great. And I did keep a journal, and actually ran out of space. And so we were back in St. John's, I had to like scramble and find another little journal kind of book because I ran out of space. But when I travel, I keep a journal because it reminds me, and they're getting less and less interesting as I get older because I go back to places I've been before. But Goes to the Abyss, I kept a journal. My handwriting's horrible, but I have a transcription of it. And even on the Return to Titanic Live thing that we did in 2005. And that helped writing the book Goes to the Abyss, was having this journal and everything. And so, I do have documentation of some of the things I've done, but my day-to-day life, not that great. It's, if they ever write an auto or a biography of Ken, other than that one book, I might have things to say, whatever that, but I mean, like his book, The Art of Ken Marshall, the biographical part of it wasn't so in depth that I had to talk about his family or anything like that. Cause, Ken's got, lovely relatives, wonderful people. And so, but, I always figured if he ever became an incredibly great artist, where, they were going to do a biography of him, they'd probably want to talk to me because I've known him for so long. But in any event, I'm not jotting down notes about, Ken or anything like that. And even Jim Cameron, I've got things that, I've, documented a little, like these expeditions, about, things he said and did or whatever and told me. And so, but, so there's some, stuff that should go into other people's biographies. But no, I do not have a plan to write my own. So, but thank you for asking.
Thank you, and it was nice meeting you.
Thank
I've
you.
got a fat loose leaf notebook down filled with every letter you ever sent me.
Well, and I've got envelope after envelope in the attic of everything you've ever sent me too. So it just, a lot of my organized files are just things are still in the envelopes I received them in, and then they're stacked up in cabinets up in the attic, because they're different sizes and they won't fit into a file folder in the file cabinet. So they just get stacked in the cabinet.
Your letters are so full of Titanic information that I've jotted down the April 14th, 1967 or 1977 letter. Don mentions so-and-so, this survivor, that survivor. So,
and I'm glad you did, because I remember you mentioned one time I had apparently written you where Ruth had described the layout of her cabin or something like that. And I'd written to you about it, but I didn't write it down for myself. and something like that. So I'm glad it's out there and documented, even though you can look on the deck plan and see it, because we know what cabin she had. But it was just so interesting that she remembered it so well. I mean, it was incredible that, the people I knew, and Ruth in particular, her story never changed. And she remembered so many little details. And yet there were other things like, in her mind, because when she first got up to A deck, there was no roof over A deck. And so she always said, well, we left from the boat deck because there was no deck above us. But we know that boat 13 was loaded from A deck. She just walked forward and then was now under, the deck. But, for the most part, her memories were just so clear. And of course, she swore the ship broke in two. She swore it broken. She'd always go like this with her fingers. And she swore it broke in two between the second and third funnel. For years, we thought it broke under the third funnel. But then after Jim went down and studied the wreck more, they've now realized it broke forward of that between the second and third funnel. And so Ruth kept getting proven right long after she was dead. It just, as she was an amazing lady. She really was. Winnie, those are the two I knew the best, the ones we dedicated illustrated history to, Winnie and Ruth. And, Winnie had led the more, varied, interesting life, but also Winnie was such a great storyteller, so she was just fun and, interesting in that respect. And, it's when I was a lad, as I say now, younger people won't appreciate this, but when I was little, it was always cool to ask an older person to recall the first time they rode in an automobile because they could. The first time I rode an automobile was probably coming home from the hospital, as an infant, a newborn. And so, but boy, when I was young, you could ask people their first car ride and, and they would tell you and, stuff like that. And so when I was young, people, they were part of that historical period that I love so much. And we just don't have that.
Or asking my grandparents who emigrated from Hungary right after World War I to describe what life there was like as opposed to what they found in Jersey City. And it's just extraordinary stuff. I wish we had written it down or recorded it.
Yes. Well, I know people always talk about, we're going to record grandma, we're going to record grandpa, whatever, then they never do. And it was funny. I talked about Andre Presley, Harriet Crosby's daughter. And when she died, her daughter-in-law, said to me, the grandchildren would really like to have you tell them about their grandmother. And I thought, well, why didn't they ask her, a month ago when she was still alive? Why hear it from me? They should have talked to her about it when she was still there. But, I certainly did. I heard all about her life from her. She had a fascinating life. But yeah, it's just, we unfortunately let, too much history go and, or we do ask and then we don't document it, we don't write it down. And I know with a cousin of mine, we were talking about our grandparents and every place they lived, and we disagreed about where they had lived when, and I was able to demonstrate that I was correct. But, not to disparage him because he's older than I am. And so he's got wonderful memories of our grandparents that I don't, that kind of thing. But history is lost eventually, and it's just sad. It's too bad. You like survivors who, when they die, all their stuff gets thrown out. That's just sad.
It's so sad. I know I have a little 95-year-old neighbor that I visit several times a week, and I just love spending time with her because, she's so wise and she's seen so much and she has so much to share.
Yeah. Well, and like I said, I'm supposed to be working on an article for the Commutator about, the history of the last, the THS the last 60 years and how much research has changed, from, like George and I said, we just wrote letters to each other and, no internet, things like that. And boy, those letters meant so much, like getting together at the conventions, is the joy of it is getting together with the people we've researched with, so to speak, and, share this. But between conventions, those letters meant so much to us to be able to just, share what we learned or what we were working on, that sort of thing. And,
so many of us had no local friends to talk about the Titanic with.
Oh,
you were the only person I knew who was interested in the Titanic at that time.
Yeah,
I treasured your letters. I was looking forward to them. Every mail.
I think you should include a letter or two in your little commentary article. That would be fun.
Well, I should haul out some of the letters and stuff. In fact, sorry, I just remembered because I heard a click that I never put my phone on airplane mode. But I was going through letters, as now that I'm, older, as I'm, as entering my golden years. But I'm also, not gonna. I learned, we'll say, the hard way, that you don't leave this sort of stuff for your loved ones or whatever, to start cleaning out now. And so I've been going through the attic and getting rid of a lot of things that just I don't need anymore, whatever. But I mentioned Rusty Brown earlier, and I was going through her letters, and she was corresponding with survivors like Edith Russell and Eva Hart or whatever. And then, Rusty died in the 80s. And I just look at that and I think, where are her letters? Because even if the survivors, hopefully they shared something about their experiences that were interesting, but, did her family just throw them out when she died? So it's just, you wonder. And like I wrote an article about Edwina McKenzie for the Commutator about, and I used all her 1912 writings. And the only letter that still exists got somehow in the hands of the THS, and it's one she mailed from the ship. Well, there's another one she mailed from the ship that somebody else said the THS never got, but it showed up at an auction or something not that many years ago. I think George is the one who shared it with me. But the problem with that is that all these other letters we have transcripts of or photocopies of, but where are the originals? And somehow they got shared with somebody, and she never got them back, I guess, and then maybe that person died and they got thrown out because they weren't written on the Titanic, but they were written immediately afterwards. And I just don't know where they are. Jill, did you mute yourself?
Jill ran away.
Did she run away on us? Her photo
No.
disappeared and it shows she's muted. Oh, she's back. Oh, did you have to go blow your nose? I'm sorry.
Everybody doesn't watch.
I know. We were just coming up with all kinds of theories about why you left. And
Oh, that's fun. What's the best one?
yeah.
This new kind of conspiracy theory. Oh, this is so much fun.
Yeah. So often the photos do disappear.
I have another question, kind of maybe a little off topic, but since we're on the subject right now, I don't recollect getting any correspondence from THS recently. Maybe I just ran out and forgot about resubscribing. Who should I write about that? Or how can I check if I'm still up to date?
Well, there's the email address, I think, is info@titanichistoricalsociety.org. But you can go to the website and there's the contact us button and you can try that.
Okay, yeah, that sounds pretty standard. All right, I'll try that because I just realized I don't think I've gotten anything, and it's not getting those paper newsletters anymore.
I know. Oh man, that's something else back in the day when the Commutator came in the mail. And I remember, I look back at them, and when I first joined in 1974, Ed was typing them. And then when, Karen, came on the scene and, they eventually got married and everything, and she took over doing the Commutator, and then she wanted to go to a color format. And we were like, oh my gosh, there goes all our dues money. It's a black and white topic. She was spot on about that because, obviously there's a lot of color you can put in the Commutator as well, especially when you're covering a convention or a visit to Belfast or something like that. And so she was right, color was the way to go. But boy, back in the day, every quarter you'd suddenly get a Commutator in the mail and you just would be so excited.
I recognize the economics of the situation, but I miss getting the paper ones as opposed to the PDFs.
I do too, and I wish there was a way. And the thing is, the THS was losing money on every member, and they didn't. She didn't want to raise the dues, and but fortunately, because Pigeon Forge and Branson rent a lot of the artifacts that they have, or a lot of the THS's artifacts are rented, They don't just lend them, they're rented. And that money made up the difference. And so, but it just got to the point where, you know, it was just too hard, you know, and doing the mailing and everything else and the printing. And I get it, because I belong to other organizations and we've had to go to an all digital magazine as well. And it just, you know, it's a sign of the times. And, you know, we have to sit on the john with our phones instead of a magazine in our hands.
I know too bad there couldn't be a more economical way to get back to it, because that was.
Yeah, I wish there was a way that you could get a choice, but if you had a choice, boy, your dues, if you were one of the ones who still wanted a paper magazine, your dues would be sky high because they wouldn't have the economy of scale. And so it was a no-winner for us. You know, it's just too bad.
Well, speaking of THS, I know the other day we were talking about convention. Do you think there'll be something next year? It sounds like this year.
Karen wanted to do something for the 60th, but we wanted to do something simple, and I just don't know that it's going to happen, because, you know, she's carrying such a heavy load, you know, since Ed died, you know, with, you know, the museum, you know, the catalog sales, you know, running the museum, and Ed's sister still helps her quite a bit. And so she would still rely on somebody else to do it. And I have to look at, I don't know where I had the energy to organize conventions back in the 80s and 90s. I had a full-time job, you know, anyway. And, you know, but I'm not the young person I was then. I'm still good looking. I'm just not as young. And so, you know, it's even a simple something. And we talked about, you know, maybe just doing one in Boston again, because what we really enjoyed was that one at the Hilton at the airport, because you just flew in and you didn't have to rent a car because the Hilton was in the airport. And then the Hilton offered shuttles into Boston. And so we thought about maybe something like that. And, you know, maybe, you know, like Paul Burns and I could put something like that together. But I've been, you know, really swamped with other things. I don't have the full-time day job, but I still have other things that, you know, take up my time. And I've been, you know, pretty swamped with a lot of those. And so, but if it's going to happen, it's got to happen soon, you know. And so maybe, you know, I've got to talk to her once more and say, but if I do talk to her, it's going to be on my shoulders to do it.
Well, now I have an idea, since we have Dave here. I mean, right now they've got that exhibit going on in New York City. Dave gives his Titanic tour. I don't know if the group has ever done that. They're trying to raise money for the Titanic Lighthouse. You know, I don't know where people would stay, but.
Well, that's the issue, because New York is a very expensive city hotel wise. You know, we explored New York in the past, and we did explore Washington, DC, and we ended up never going to DC because of the price. And that was, the Hilton in Boston was expensive, you know, being a Hilton, but the fact that you didn't have any other transportation costs in your airfare, you know, because like when you have an Indian Orchard where the THS Museum is, everybody has to rent a car. The hotels are very affordable, but you got to get to Springfield. And so, you know, that was, yeah, you see, like Dave says, the convention centers are not competitive, you know, so they're not competing with price. And so, you know, New York is a hard one. And then the Queen Mary even got too expensive for us. And of course, they've only recently reopened. I don't know how much of their, you know, convention facilities and hotel facilities are open. I think they are, but they haven't opened all the restaurants or anything. But their prices went way, way up. We looked into them a few years ago. And, you know, we want to keep it affordable for the members. And when we tried to do it in Branson, you know, then it got expensive because, like Karen said, you can't come to Branson and not avail yourself of the features, you know, and the attractions, even though that's not why we're there. You know, we're there to see each other. And so they put together this sort of package, and it was so pricey. And yet Branson, again, you know, you have to rent a car to get there. It'd be great to see the Branson Museum.
Yeah, because I looked into it too. You fly in and the airport's nowhere near the museum.
Nowhere near. And so there's all these things to think about. And so, you know, the likeliest place at the moment would be sort of the Hilton at Boston, if it's available, you know, this sort of thing. But also, you know, and I know that technically they consider the pandemic to be over, But whenever I hear about one of these gatherings, like there's these Titanic cons that Bill Willard puts together, and apparently at the last one, a lot of people came home with COVID.
Yeah.
And, which is sad, because I mean, I've had COVID. It wasn't a bad case, I'm vaccinated, whatever. And it was like having a bad head cold, but I still don't want to get it again. It might not be that good next time, it could be way worse.
Me too, and he said the Queen Mary too.
The other day I read that 1,700 people a day are still dying from COVID.
Well, they are. I went to a funeral just about a week ago for a former coworker, and it was sad because she had messaged me on Facebook one day, and then 2 days later, I got the word that she had died of COVID. And she was impaired. She had a lung issue, but yes, people are still dying. And I talked to my doctor about. I said, well, we haven't had a new vaccine lately, and he said, no, there hasn't been one lately. And he said, and vaccines do wear out. They do. You overcome your vaccine, or it eventually leaves your system, so to speak. So
we'll never be rid of it, but it'll just try to keep it under control.
Right.
I mean,
exactly.
it's not going away.
No, it'll never go away. It's here to stay now. And, we just hope that it's like killer bees where it becomes less killer, that kind of thing as time goes by. But yeah, so there's that to consider too. So, but I'd love to have a convention because there are so many people who come to these conventions and it's the only time I get to see them. And I really enjoy them. They're lovely people. I just, you see familiar faces year after year. And, Karen and I were talking about how many of the familiar faces are gone now, not just the survivors, but people who were regulars at conventions, for years and years, and, that have passed away because, I mean, gosh, next year I will have been a THS member for 50 years.
Wow.
And George too, and it's like, so, and I think Ray Lapine, who joined, I think in 66 or right about then, I think he is our most long-term member. I think the last original member other than Ed might have been Edith Haseman, who died at 101, was one of the survivors, because in the beginning they had more survivors as members than regular people. But, I think after Ed died, I think Ray was the most long-term member, and then Ken Marshall maybe after him. I think he joined about 67, but there may be one or two others. But, it's like there are no original members of the society after 60 years. I remember going to the 77 convention, and there was a guy there who was 86 years old. He was 21 when the Titanic went down, and he was very healthy. He didn't even look his age at all. And he was just one of the regular members. He'd come to the convention, and his wife, I think they were divorced, whether she was still alive or not, I don't know. But he said he and his wife had lunch with some people she knew. And then years later, he picked up a night to remember, and there were their names in the back. It was Norman Campbell Chambers and his wife. And they had lunch with these people, and he was interested in the Titanic, and he had no idea he was having lunch with two people who had been on the Titanic. And of course, here he was, at a Titanic convention at the age of 86 and just hanging out with the rest of us. And, but I'm sure he's gone now. Being,
yeah, so it's a good reason to get everyone to get, because virtual is nice, but live is better, it's like,
yeah, it is. It really is, and then we all get together, like, Ed and Amy always drive and they bring a trunk full of alcohol, and then they, have a big party in their room late at night after all the events are over, and we just get to sit and chat, and have fun. It's like, a really good time always, and so, yeah, I need to see if I can, talk to Karen, maybe Paul Burns, and say, you know what, let's just do it. And, for years, we'd always have Ken be a speaker, and it's like, well, you just can't have Ken Marshall over and over and over again, as good a speaker as he is. And, it's kind of harder and harder, to find people. And there are people who are good speakers, and you ask them, and, like George, who doesn't really want to get up in front of people, and it can't be me every time. And so, well, as Dave knows, we approached Dave because, he gave these tours, and it's like, well, do you want to talk about that at the Boston convention? the one at the Hilton. And he said yes. And so, and occasionally we get people who come forward, and like we had at that convention, we had that wonderful lady who did all the, she was involved in the DNA of the unknown child, but she talked about forensic DNA and what they go through to, when they recover people from crash sites, they've been missing for 50 years and that kind of stuff. We've had every so often we get somebody who's just wonderful who just comes to us and says, I'd love to speak if you're having a gathering. And
Well,
so,
like Tad Kent and Bill Rundstedt, they did come and.
well, and we asked Bill, and he did speak at Lake George with Shelley Binder, the Axe relative, but he wasn't too keen on it, but he agreed to do it and he was fine. He was a great speaker. And I don't know if Tad has ever been to a convention. So there are these wonderful people out there who are involved in great projects that are exciting to talk about. And so, it's wonderful. But also it's hard because, like if you want, like if someone's coming anyway, we'll ask them to be a speaker, but if someone's not coming and you ask them, you're kind of obligated to pay their way. And that's kind of hard because it was easier when we'd have 1,000 people and we could pay for every survivor and an escort to their airfare, their hotel, everything. But now when we get when the conventions are like 50, 60 people, to expect everybody to chip in to fly somebody in or something, it's hard, and so like I'm happy to do it because I'm going to be there anyway, but I shouldn't be the featured speaker every time, that kind of thing. And so, and like we were fortunate with Brian Hawley when he spoke at Lake George, because he could get airfare, without paying. He knew somebody who could get him there. And so that was like, okay, great, good. Because, and I remember one time John Maxton Graham asked if he could be a speaker. And then it was like, well, do you pay us to come here? And it was like, well, you asked to speak. It's like, you want to be here. It's like, you want to be here, prove it, pay your own way. But if we had asked you, it'd be different. I'm sorry.
Gas is expensive, travel is expensive.
It is. And so it's hard to get speakers. And, and there were some people like my friend Barbara Magruder, who lives in Boston, and she's been a member for years. I met her at a THS convention and, we've been very, very good friends ever since. And she gives the best disaster tour of Boston. I mean, like the Coconut Grove fire, there's the chapel that was built in memory of Leslie Lindsay, who went down with the Lusitania, that had the molasses flood in 1919, and she can take you to all these sites. But boy, if you asked her to stand up on a bus and give this tour, she would just fall apart. She wouldn't do it, which is sad because, she's got that. But she's the one who got us interested when we had the last Boston one in going to Mount Auburn Cemetery. Because, there were so many Titanic people, either memorials or graves at Mount Auburn in Cambridge. And that was because, she originally had gone there and like tracked down as many as people and exactly where they were. And so we were able to tell the bus company, here's where they are, take these people there. And then I think we had people on board who were able to, we gave them notes so they could be the leader. But, you get people who are very, very knowledgeable and they just don't want to get up in front of people. And then you get people who
like a family reunion where everybody just, what do people do at family reunions? They don't really have like.
They play football in the backyard,
Yeah, like party, what if we just find a mansion and all go
you all tell stories about each other.
Somewhere with, canoes. Like I loved when you guys went to the Adirondacks because I was thinking that would be so fun, where you could just enjoy the property, have a bonfire, run a canoe, or, where it doesn't have to be too.
Well, that's it. It's like George said, we just love to just get together and visit, but you can't promise that to everybody. Because not everybody's into it that way. Some people, they want to come and they want to hear a speaker. They want to really feel like they're getting their money's worth. And for them sitting around, and especially if they haven't done a lot of research and they're not really involved in the community and don't know the other people, you've got to give them something. And back in the day with the conventions, and people would complain about it, but they would complain because you had more than one thing to do. And it's like, well, yeah, because if you don't take the bus tour, we're going to show you movies, you know, so that, and then like, but I want to see that movie, but I want to take the bus tour
Right,
because,
it's
you know,
about
now with DVDs and
too.
streaming, we don't even show movies at the convention. There's no point. Everybody's seen them. But, you know, 30 years ago, we showed Atlantic, you know, we had to hire someone from a temp agency to sit there and just stare at the movie and run the VHS for us because we didn't want to ask any of the members to volunteer because they'd paid to be there. But now everybody's seen Atlantic. You can just Google it and watch it on YouTube. And so, you know, the films aren't out there anymore. You know, we used to show movies. We used to have survivors give talks. You know, all these things are gone. And so we're just down to, we've just got to get some good speakers and have a nice dinner. Maybe a
What
tour.
about Catalina Island? And we'll make what's his name again? We could put him in charge of
Oh, the
that
guy
one.
at the museum. Yeah. Well, they don't have the exhibit there anymore.
We just want their space because their space is so nice. That big patio upstairs.
Yeah. No, except of course it's Catalina. It's not easy to get to, and you know, you get not a lot of hotels.
I've got two questions. The first one, would Lake George be a viable option, or has that got all the disadvantages that the others?
Well, like Lake George was great because it was affordable, but again, it was far away. You know, we had everybody had to drive there.
Yeah.
But that is a thought, you know, because we did get a good crowd there, so maybe that is something to try again.
I had a lot of fun there. There was a lot of things to do.
Yeah.
I wish I could have gone to that one. I really wanted to go. I love Lake George.
Well, and come to find out, one of the Fortune sisters, Ethel Fortune, lived at Lake George at one point.
Oh, yeah.
And so we had a, you know, I didn't know that a survivor had lived in Lake George. It's like, oh man.
Years ago, I discovered that one of the survivors from Bayonne lived at the address that one of my Cub Scouts now lived at. And I copied all the stuff about it to them, and they were just amazed, particularly by the fact that in 1912, they published people's home addresses in newspaper articles.
Well, that was Roberto Perroni, who's done those wonderful cutaway models, you know, the Titanic, Lusitania, and Normandy. They're on the Queen Mary, and you know, we featured him in the Commutator and need to again. But he's a priest, and he was living in Hollywood at this church on Fargo Street. And it was like, why does that sound familiar? And I looked, and there was a third-class passenger from Los Angeles, a lady who, she was a widow. She was a young woman, but she was widowed, and her husband is buried just blocks from my house. And she lived on Fargo Street with her sister and her brother-in-law just up the street from this guy. But unfortunately, her house is gone. But it was like, what are the odds he lives on the street where this woman lived? But the woman, she went down with the ship. She went back to, you know, Finland or wherever she was from, and was bringing some of her husband's family back with her, and then they all died. But it's like, oh, Fargo. And it was that block, the block Roberto's church was on. So. Well, and Marjorie Robb used to.
Don, in addition to the emails I write on White Star, I've got hundreds, literally, of pieces of paper memorabilia going back to Oceanic One on about White Star ships and the history. If I can swing the time and you put together something in a place I can get to, I'd be delighted to talk about that if people are interested.
Oh, yay.
That's great. Write your name down.
In fact, there's a thread on ET that's called The Life and Death of Ships, which I've done a couple of times over the years, dealing with the maiden voyages and last voyages of various White Star ships. And I've included copies of a lot of the postcards and the memorabilia. So a lot of that is up there on ET already.
Cool.
George, I am still the moderator at ET.
Okay.
Phil and I are the only ones left out of the original crew.
A lot of water under the bridge.
Yep. I think he started that in the message board in 1999 or 2000 or something like that.
I was Molly Brown back then. That was back when we had usernames instead of using our real names.
Don, the second part of my question, it's sort of a subjective impression of mine, but it's a suggestion that you might want to consider. If you hold a convention in a resort area like Branson and stuff, the thing that just leaped out at me when the arrangements were made for the proposed convention in Branson, that in the evening, Karen or someone had chosen what entertainment we were going to see. You know, tonight we have to go see Dolly Parton. Tomorrow we go see the Ice Capades. What if a person doesn't care two hoots about those things?
Right.
They'll have the whole city. They could choose their own entertainment, and you could reduce the price of the convention by that amount. You know, the tickets to these events.
Exactly. And that's why, I want to keep it as affordable as possible when we do it. And so, that we don't have these extraneous activities, or, it's up to people themselves. Like when we did Boston, if people wanted to take the shuttle in and see Quincy Market and Faneuil Hall, they could.
Absolutely.
That was their business. Yeah. So that's a good point. And if we do it someplace where, like if you do go to Branson, and I'm not saying we do again, because I really want to do it someplace that's easy to get to, unless it's really good, like Lake George. But and you just want Lake George because it reminds you of your own name. The idea is that, I want something that people can do when they're not attending the convention, because again, we don't have as many activities as we used to. We don't show the videos. We may not have as many speakers. We don't have the vendors anymore. And so it'd be nice if there's something for people to do during the day. And so again, that was what was nice about Boston, was that people could then take the shuttle into town, and then they'd be there in the evening for the banquet and the speakers, and then hang out afterwards and all party or whatever. So this is making me want to get in touch with Karen and say, we need to revive this and need to get cracking, because here it is, April. And if we do it, we'd like to do it in the fall, because that's when the THS's 60th anniversary would be.
And fall is so beautiful in New York, all the colors.
You in New York,
Maybe I'm feeling homesick because I'm in Colorado. I don't know.
How about Buffalo in the winter? It's like,
maybe we can like convention in Ossining and then take the train into New York, take these tours.
Yeah.
There's so much to do in New York.
Well, there is. It's a toddle in town.
Oh, that was fun to share ideas. But
I was
yeah,
going to say it's my kind of town, but that's your
The Bronx is up and the battery's down.
it's so expensive.
Oh, right in a hole in the ground, New York.
Well, everybody's probably hungry. Did you guys all have dinner, or you all have to eat dinner then?
Well, I didn't, but that's because it started at 3. Oh my gosh, you've been doing this 3.5 hours.
I think we beat last time. Oh, Dave does a Titanic tour in Woodlawn Cemetery. Come on, Dave, where can we stay that we can stay cheap in New York, but then like take the train in? Or because once you're in New York, you don't need a car or a bus or anything. But we'd have to.
Always the why.
With New Jersey, what about New Jersey? Or I know a friend that owns a bed and breakfast in Brooklyn.
Yeah, well, it's got to be some kind of place I can ask around. I guess there's got to be something friendly, especially after the pandemic, where they're trying to get people in. We are expecting a lot of tourists, so.
So fun, a lot of people haven't done it, and there's so many things in New York. That's where everybody got came into, and then the story that you give when you give your tour is so fantastic. It just brings everybody.
New York would be great. I just have to make a fast train ride from Jersey City.
Yeah, there you go.
It was just an idea, because I don't know how long that Titanic exhibit's going to be there. I know they extended it, and I know that exhibit hosted the Titanic Lighthouse people today. They had a big convention gathering there today.
Yeah, I saw some pictures. Now, Woodlawn is my go-to for foliage in the autumn, but in the spring, the sakura are amazing at Greenwood Cemetery. So I go to these places all year round, but those are especially the best times to go to these places.
If you go see Asters are. Strauss Waltz, even
Well,
though.
maybe the Titanic Book Club needs to go to New York sometime.
Yeah, they do will plan. Pretty good. Yeah, but whatever you do, we'll all be paying attention. I
Okay.
know it's a big burden for you to have to think, especially when, how many years? Wow, 50 years of thinking of convention locations and speakers. You have to get
Well,
tired after a while.
That's it. I mean, I think the very first convention was, I think, and we'll call it a convention. It was the first gathering for the THS. And I think it was like 1965 in New York. There weren't very many people there. I know Frank Goldsmith went to it. But then I joined, I just missed the 73 one, which is in Greenwich. But that's again where 77 was held. And then after that, 82 Philadelphia, and then it just ballooned from there. But then, again, as times became more modern and everything, and the survivors passed away, it just became a smaller and smaller gathering each time. So we'll have to, I'll talk to Karen again, and maybe we can get Paul Burns involved and we can put something together. But I kind of think like the easiest thing, again, would be just Boston, just because it's just, it's just right there in the airport, that was just.
Recreate the wheel, so.
Although really, realistically, you could go to any city where there's a airport hotel within a block or something, which would be doable if you just stayed in the area.
There's a Marriott on the grounds of Newark Airport.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Let's vote Boston.
Yeah. So let's.
Do those airport hotels have enough, parking? I would probably decide to drive rather than fly. But so many hotels and that, if you don't get the parking place out in front of the hotel, you got to drive a half a mile to find some place to park. But if they have a parking lot, or parking structure or whatever, that would be wonderful.
That would be, because I would fly in. So all those people that fly, that saves a lot of money if you don't have to rent a car too.
Yeah, very true.
I think you should do that. That's easy. You've done it before. You could just pull out your own itinerary.
And if it isn't Boston, maybe something, I mean, I don't think we've never done Chicago, so I'm not sure what we could see there, but, could find out. But mostly it's about getting together, that kind of thing. So, let me talk to Paul about it. Paul and Karen.
What's that little island in Michigan where they have like a.
Oh, Mackinac?
Oh, is that really expensive to go to that?
Occurred to me, but the airplane, the airports and that would be the problem again, because there's no airport close.
Yeah, and you can't drive on the island, so it's harder to get that you ferry over or whatever. San Diego's nice because the airport's right downtown. It's quite a drive. But also there's the problem, which I always found, is that people don't like to leave their time zone. And you could have something in Denver and people from Seattle won't go. But if you had it in Los Angeles, they're here and they thank you for having it so close to home. And it's like, really? Because Denver's like only one time zone away. But it's funny how people, they equate time zones with distance, and it's hard for them,
That's true.
So, but we'll think about that. We'll kind of put that.
Organize it. They say the organizers are supposed to try to make themselves happy because they're the ones putting the work in.
Yeah, we'll put our heads together and see, see what we can do with it. See where we can go.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. This has been fun. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did.
Very much so. Very much.
Oh, good.
Yeah, this was great.
I'm so glad Mark joined us too. Awesome, Mark and Charlotte. And Charlotte's a little quiet because she has a puppy at home. Charlotte, you can just show us your puppy. We just want to see the baby.
He's actually asleep next to me now.
Oh, yeah, don't wake him up. Puppies. Yeah.
Yes.
And it was so fun having
Thank you, though. This was
Dave,
amazing. Thank you all.
Dave, I will get to one of your New York tours one of these days. It's only a train ride away.
Yeah, there you go. Good.
All right, well, I hope
You-
everyone has a wonderful night.
All right, you too. Thank you very much. This was fun.
Yes, it was.
All right. You guys take care.
Nice seeing and meeting some of you.
Yes, likewise.
Pleasure to see you, Mark, for the first time.
That's
Yeah.
Take care.
All right, we'll see you at the next one.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Bye.
Bye. This is fun. Thanks, George. Are you feeling exhausted from last night?
Pardon?
Are you feeling exhausted from last night?
Yeah, very much so.
I turned it off. When the sinking happened, I was like, I'm done. I can't stay up anymore.
How late did the one that you were on go, George?
3:30.
Oh my gosh.
I think I went to bed at 11:30.
6 hours from 9:30 till 3:30. It was a long night.
Gosh, that is a long night. Wow. So were you guys answering questions all that time? Because there were so many questions coming in.
I had the occasional one, but Tad and Bill and Kent, and Tom, and a couple other people that had actually created the videos, they were all fielding questions too. So, it was mostly just a matter of sitting there and then answer the occasional question or make the occasional comment. But it was a long time to be sitting like that.
That's a long time. Did you get my comment?
Yeah, I did see it, as a matter of fact.
I was
Thank
like, you gotta give $10 to George, $5 to George.
There's the puppy sleeping.
Oh, he's out of energy now.
Yeah. He's going to obedience school in the morning, so he'll be getting his energy out again.
Oh, I should stop the live